Buenos días con todos. Soy
Good
Carla
morning to
Sáenz,
everyone. My
asesora
name is
regional de
Carla
bioética de
Sáenz.
la
I'm a
Organización
regional
Panamericana de la Salud.
advisor for bioethics for Pan American
Antes
Health
de
Organization.
dar inicio a la
Before
sesión,
we begin our
quiero
session,
dejarles saber
I'd
que
like to let you know
tendremos traducción.
that
Lo
we
voy a
do
decir en
have
inglés porque los
simultaneous interpretation
participantes el día de
available,
hoy van a hablar
and
español.
we're going to have a Spanish
Hello,
session today.
everybody. I'm Carla Sáenz. I am PAHO's regional bioethics advisor. And we're going to have a session with simultaneous interpretation today. And if you want to listen to this session in English, please go to the little globe that says interpretation on the bottom right of your screen and click on English. ¿Ok? Bienvenidos nuevamente.
Once
Esta es
again,
una
welcome
nueva sesión
everyone.
de nuestra
This is
serie
a
de
new
seminarios
session for our
virtuales
series
sobre
of
temas relacionados
webinars
con los ensayos clínicos.
related to clinical
Esta
trials.
serie es un
This
esfuerzo
series is an
colectivo del
effort
Programa
on
Regional
the
de
part of
Bioética,
the
que hace parte de la
national, or
Unidad
rather
de
regional
Ciencia y
bioethics program
Conocimiento para el Impacto
that
del
involves
Departamento
science
de
and knowledge
Evidencia
for
e
impact
Inteligencia para la Acción en
stemming from the
Salud
Department
de la
of
OPS y de
Science
nuestra
and
Unidad de
Intelligence at
Calidad y
PAHO, as
Regulación
well as our
de
Quality and
Medicamentos y
Regulation Unit
Tecnologías Sanitarias, que hace
for
parte del
medication
Departamento de
and health
Innovación, Acceso a
technologies.
Medicamentos y Tecnologías
And
Sanitarias de
that's
la
what
OPS.
the department does, is
El tema para
enable
esta
access to
sesión
these
es
items.
la nueva
The
guía de
topic
buenas
for
prácticas
today's session is the
clínicas
new guidelines for good clinical
E6R3 de la
practices,
Conferencia
which is the
Internacional de Armonización. Quiero hacer
document for
algunas
the
aclaraciones
National
sobre
Harmonization
nuestra
Conference. I'd
sesión
like
antes
to mention some
de
details about our
presentar a nuestra
session
primera
before we
expositora.
begin with our first
No
presenter.
vamos a emitir un
We will
certificado
not
de
be issuing
asistencia
any
ni un
type of
certificado de
certificate of attendance
participación
or
a quienes
participation
estén el
to
día de
those
hoy
of you who are
escuchando
joining
este
us
webinario.
here today on this
Sin
webinar.
embargo, vamos a
Nevertheless,
compartir la
we
grabación de la
will be
sesión
sharing the recording of the
por
session
medio de nuestra lista
through
ética de la
our
investigación. Y vamos a
list
poner en breve
for
el
ethical
enlace para
research.
suscribirse a
We
la
will be
lista
sharing the
para
link that
aquellos
will
que no
allow you
estuvieran
to
suscritos
register
ya.
for that
¿Ok?
list in case you have not already
Además,
done so.
ustedes pueden ver la
Furthermore,
grabación
you
de esta
will be able to
sesión
see the
y la
recording of this
grabación
session,
de sesiones
as well
previas de
as
este
the
seminario
recordings of
enfocado en
prior
ensayos
sessions
clínicos,
of this series
tanto
focusing on clinical
en el
trials,
sitio
both
del Programa Regional de
on the
Bioética
website of
de la
the
OPS,
Regional Bioethical
como en
Program
el
at PAHO,
portal de
as well as
ensayos
the
clínicos de las
clinical trials
Américas de la
website
OPS. Y voy a
for
compartir
the
en breve
Americas
el
at PAHO.
enlace en el
And we will
portal.
be sharing the links to those
Al portal,
websites
perdón.
as well.
Cualquier comentario para
Any
presentarse o compartir
comment
bibliografía,
or question, or if
pueden
you'd
usar
like
el
to
chat.
introduce yourselves or share
Sin
your
embargo, para
background, you can do so
facilitar
in the
las
chat.
preguntas
However, in order to
durante la
facilitate
sesión,
the
les
Q&A
agradecemos
during
que
the
usen
session,
la
we will be
funcionalidad
asking you
de
to use
preguntas y
the
respuestas.
Q&A
Pueden
function
iniciar
to submit your
enviando sus
questions or
preguntas
comments.
desde el inicio,
And
desde
you
la primera
can submit your
presentación,
questions or
pero
comments from the
solamente
outset of
las
the presentation,
abordaremos al final de
but we
las
will
tres
be addressing
presentaciones del
these
día de hoy.
questions and comments once we hear all three
Entonces,
presentations that we have
sin más
scheduled for today's
preámbulo,
webinar.
quiero
Without further
invitar
ado,
a la
I'd
doctora
like to
Patricia
invite
Saidón,
Dr.
a quien
Patricia
ustedes creo que
Saidon,
conocen ya.
whom I'm sure you all
Ella es
know.
médica neuróloga
She
y ha
is a
sido en el
neurologist
pasado jefa de
and
ensayos
has
clínicos de
been in the
ANMAT, la
past
Agencia
the
Regulatoria de
clinical trials
Argentina,
chief
y coordinadora del
for
Grupo de Buenas
ANMAT in
Prácticas
Argentina
Clínicas
and
de
a
la Red
coordinator of good clinical
Regional de
practices
Autoridades
as
Regulatorias.
part of the
Actualmente
regional
es consultora
network of regulatory
internacional
authorities.
de la Unidad de Calidad de Regulación de
She is
Medicamentos y
a
Tecnologías
consultant for the
Sanitarias
Medication
de la
and
OPS.
Health Technology
Adelante,
Division at PAHO.
Patricia.
Go ahead,
Es un
Patricia.
gusto
You have the
compartir con
floor, and
vosotros
it's a
el
real
día de
pleasure
hoy.
to have you with us today.
Gracias, Carla. Es
Thank
un
you,
gusto
Carla.
compartir
And it's a
con
real pleasure for
ustedes
me to share this
esta
time with all of you,
exposición
as
y
well as this
bueno,
presentation.
con Laura Traversi de ANMAT y con Nicolás
And
Gutiérrez
it's
de
a pleasure
Chile,
to work with Nicolás
poder dar un
Gutierrez from
enfoque
Chile
de
and
estas
Laura
nuevas guías de
Traversi
buenas prácticas
to
clínicas.
focus
Voy
more
a
on these
compartir mi presentación.
guidelines for good clinical practices. Let me share my screen.
¿Ven ahí bien la presentación?
Can you all see my presentation?
Perfecto.
Perfecto.
Yes, we can.
Entonces,
Perfectly.
vamos a hablar entonces de esta
Very well then.
nueva guía de buenas
We will
prácticas
talk about
clínicas,
this new
ICH
guide for
6F3.
good
Y lo
clinical
primero que voy a
practices.
hacer es dar un contexto
And the first thing I like to
de que
do
este
is provide
estándar
some
nuevo,
context for
en qué
this new
tipos de
standard
estudios
and the types
tiene alcance,
of
para
studies
qué tipos de estudios tiene
that
alcance y
is
cuál es el
are included in
contexto
it, the scope,
actual en la
the types of
región
studies,
de ese tipo
and
de
what
estudios.
the context
Primero, definir
for
entonces
this program
que
is
hay
region-wide.
muchos tipos de estudios
First and
clínicos.
foremost, let's just say that there are many
La
types of clinical
Organización
studies and
Mundial de la
trials.
Salud
The World Health
define la
Organization
investigación en salud
defines
como cualquier
clinical
actividad de las ciencias de la salud que
trial as
involucre la
any
recolección sistemática
activity
de
in
datos
health science that
para
involves the
la
systematic collection
inversión
or
de
analysis of
nuevos
data for the
conocimientos,
purposes
y
of
esto incluye
generating new
entonces
knowledge.
estudios de observación
And
y también
therefore,
estudios de
this includes
intervención u otro tipo de
observation,
interacciones, ya sea
intervention,
de
or
manera
other types
directa
of
o a través de la
interaction
alteración
studies
del ambiente
with
o de la
researchers,
recolección
be
o uso
it
de
direct
material
or through
biológico o de datos
any changes
personales
to
o de
their
organismos.
environment or through the collection and
Dentro
use of
del conjunto de
biological
estos
material or personal
estudios,
data or any type
el
of record.
ensayo clínico es una
So
parte de
clinical
estos
trials
estudios y
form
son
a
estudios de
portion or part of
investigación
this
que asignan
research in health.
prospectivamente
And it's any
participantes
study
humanos o grupos
that
humanos
prospectively
a
assigns human
una o más
participants or groups of
intervenciones
humans
relacionadas con la
to one
salud.
or
Es
more
decir, un ensayo
interventions
clínico
that are
es
related to health.
intervención y es para
So
evaluar los
clinical
efectos
trials
sobre el
mean
estado de salud.
intervention, and the
Pero
purpose is to
esto no
assess
siempre son
any
medicamentos, puede ser,
effects
por
on
ejemplo, con
health
técnicas
outcomes.
quirúrgicas, con
Now,
muchas
we could
otras
have different
intervenciones, es
types of
decir, que hay
interventions,
muchos
surgical
tipos
and
de
others.
ensayos clínicos
And
en
with that,
muchas
I'd like to say that there
situaciones
are
de
many
salud.
different types of clinical
Para
trials
todos
depending on the
los estudios
circumstances.
clínicos, para la
For all clinical
investigación
studies,
en
for
salud
all
en general, la
health
Organización
research in
Mundial de la
general,
Salud
the
ha
World
emitido
Health
recientemente
Organization has
esta
recently
guía para
issued
buenas
this
prácticas
guidance
en
for
los
best practices
ensayos clínicos
for
para el
clinical trials.
conjunto de los ensayos clínicos
And
que busca el
this is
fortalecimiento
part
de los
of
ensayos
the
clínicos
body
para
of work
proporcionar
that
evidencia de
seeks
alta
to strengthen
calidad
clinical trials
cuando hay
to provide
intervención sobre
high
salud.
quality
Los
evidence
aspectos
on health
metodológicos, los
interventions.
aspectos de cómo
It
se
includes the
conduce ese estudio.
methodological
Pero esto es
aspects and
para el
other procedural
conjunto,
aspects.
entonces,
So
de los
when
ensayos
we look
clínicos.
at the total body of work here, we
Vamos un poco
incorporate
al
all of these
contexto en que
components.
se hace
Let's look at the
investigación
context
en
in which
nuestra región,
the
América
research is
Latina.
carried
Ustedes
out
ven
in
ahí
our region, the
los
Latin American
ensayos
region.
clínicos
You
registrados
can see here
en
the
la
number of
plataforma
clinical
internacional
trials
de
recorded in
ensayos
the
clínicos de la
International
Organización Mundial de la
Clinical
Salud.
Trials
Y ahí ven
platform
entonces desde
for WHO.
1999 hasta la
So
fecha
we see here that
cuáles son los
since
países que
1999
han
to date, we
registrado
can see
estudios
all the
clínicos.
countries that have
Ahí ven los 10
conducted
primeros.
the
La lista
highest
es
number
larga.
of clinical studies.
Y en la
The
segunda,
US
el segundo gráfico,
is
lo que
in
ustedes
first
pueden ver
place here
ahí es
on
cuál
the
es
left-hand column.
la
The
proporción de
right-hand
los
column
ensayos clínicos
relates
registrados
to the
en los
proportion of
diferentes
clinical trials
países
that have
de
been
nuestra región.
recorded in the different countries in the region.
Entonces, Estados Unidos
So as I stated previously,
tiene, digamos, la mayor
the
cantidad
US
de registros
has
dentro
recorded
de
the highest
lo
number
que
of
es
clinical trials,
Latinoamérica, Brasil, México y Argentina
and they are followed by
y Colombia son
other
entonces
Latin
los
American
5 primeros
countries,
países que tienen más
Mexico,
registros
Brazil, Argentina, and Chile,
clinical
who are
en la
the other
plataforma
countries in
de
our continent that have recorded the
ICH.
highest number of clinical trials.
Ahora hay un subconjunto de los
Now we
ensayos
have a
clínicos
subset
que
of
son
clinical
ensayos
trials,
clínicos
which are clinical
con
trials
productos sanitarios,
that involve
pero que van a dar
healthcare
lugar
products
a un registro.
that
Este es el
will
ámbito de
be
aplicación y alcance
undertaken
de las
to
agencias
establish a record.
regulatorias
And
nacionales,
this
es
is
decir,
something that falls within
ensayos
the purview
clínicos
of
que
national
son
health
con
authorities.
productos
So these are
sanitarios,
clinical
pero que
trials
tienen la
involving
intención
healthcare
final
products that
de
have the
o de
final
producir
purpose
un registro
of either
sanitario o de
producing
modificar un
a
registro
health
sanitario
record or
ya
modifying
existente.
an existing
Entonces,
health
el
record.
objetivo de estos
So the
ensayos
objective for
clínicos
these
con
types
fines
of clinical
registrales es
trials
obtener datos que
that have
avalen
these
el
purposes is
perfil
to
beneficio-riesgo
record
que
data
sea
related to
positivo en una
risks benefits
tecnología para poder entonces
that apply to
proceder
different
a la
technologies and that will allow us
autorización
to
de esa
proceed to
tecnología.
the authorization
¿Cuál
to
es la
use these
distribución
types
de
of technologies.
este tipo
Now,
de
what is
ensayos
the
clínicos
distribution of these types of
en
clinical
nuestra región y
trials
en el
the
mundo?
world
Ustedes
over?
pueden ver ahí,
You can see
entonces,
here
entre 2010 y
that between
2020,
2010 and
que
2020,
ahí yo separé, por un lado, la
I
región
separated
del norte de América,
the North America
después
region.
viene Asia,
It's followed
después
by
viene
Asia.
Europa,
That in turn is followed by
después
Europe,
Japón,
then
Oceanía, y en
Japan,
verde, un
Oceania,
poquitito, ahí
and in
abajo,
green,
América
dark green, we
Latina y
can see
posteriormente
Latin
África.
America, and lastly, Africa.
Actualmente, América Latina
So at the
realiza
present
prácticamente
time, Latin
todos los
America,
países alrededor
when we
del
consider all of the
4%,
countries,
entre 4 a veces un
conducts
5% de
roughly
la
4 to
investigación con
5%
ensayos, con este tipo
of
de ensayos clínicos a
research
nivel
with these types of clinical
internacional.
trials at the
Y
international
acá
level.
ven entonces la
And we can
distribución
see here
por
the
países
distribution
y
broken
pueden
down by
ver ahí
country.
que los países que más
And as shown,
ensayos de este
the
tipo tienen
countries
son
that
Brasil,
record the highest numbers of these types of
Argentina,
clinical trials are Brazil,
México y
Argentina,
Chile.
Mexico,
Y
and Chile.
el numerito que está al lado es el
The
número
number
que
that
ese país
appears on the
ocupa a
right
nivel
is the
internacional.
number that of the ranking of the country at the international level.
También ustedes pueden ver si la variación
You can
del
also see here on this
2010-2020
slide whether or
es
not the
hacia arriba o hacia abajo.
2010-2020 variance
Es
is
decir,
trending
si
upward or
está
downward.
aumentando
So
su
green
grado de
means that the
participación o
trend
está
is
disminuyendo su grado de participación o simplemente no la ha
rising,
pegado
and red means that the
ese
trend
periodo
is
de tiempo
declining.
2010-2020.
Gray means that there's been no variance over the length of that time frame.
Bueno, en este contexto, para este
So in this
tipo de
context,
ensayos,
for
los
these types
sistemas
of
regulatorios
trials,
entonces involucran múltiples organismos de aprobación.
regulatory
Hay
systems require
organismos de
multiple
aprobación en cada país, en todo el mundo, y
authorizations
es
and
necesario
regulatory authorities.
entonces
There
lograr
are
un estándar
regulatory
que
authorities all over the
logre
world, and
garantizar que se
in order
desarrollen,
to address this,
registren y
it was
mantengan
possible and
medicamentos seguros y
necessary to
eficaces, un
create a
estándar que
standard
haga que yo pueda
that
aceptar datos
we
entre un
can
país y otro país.
use to
Porque no sería
compare data
lógico
between one country and another.
repetir
It
ese
wouldn't be
ensayo en cada
logical
país,
to repeat
primero
the
porque no
same trial in
alcanzaría
each
el
country,
tamaño muestral que tiene
first
que
and
tener,
foremost,
y
because it
sobre todo
wouldn't
porque está
have the
sobreexponiendo
necessary
entonces
sample
a
size
los
that is required,
participantes.
and
De
this
esta
would
manera entonces ese
be a
estándar
huge
tiene que
handicap to
ser
participating
entonces de
countries. And
establecer
therefore,
cuáles son las
this standard
responsabilidades,
was
de
established
establecer
for the
cómo se debe
development,
diseñar,
recording, and
cómo se
maintenance of
debe
safe
registrar, cómo se
medications.
debe
It
reportar
defines
en
terms,
un ensayo clínico
responsibilities, and
y cómo se
establishes
debe
how to
también
design
efectuar el
a
control de
model
calidad y
for the clinical
aseguramiento de calidad.
study, the
También
information that
cómo
it needs to
analizar los
provide
resultados.
on the
Todas
product
estas cosas
being
entonces
subjected to the research and
fueron
how
normadas en
to
un
record
estándar
it
del Consejo
in
Internacional
the
para
standard.
la
All of this
Armonización
is
de
then
Requisitos
submitted to
Técnicos
the
en Productos
International
Farmacéuticos de
Council
Uso Humano, la
on
ICH, ahora
the
la ICE,
harmonization of
ahora yo
technical
voy a
requirements
entrar a
for
la ICH,
pharmaceutical
que reúne en
products
1990
that
a
are
las
used by humans
agencias
that it
regulatorias
has
nacionales de
since
industria
1990
farmacéutica en pos de
brought together
justamente desarrollar
multiple
esos
national
estándares.
regulatory agencies.
Vamos a hablar un poco de los
Let's talk
antecedentes.
about the
¿Cuánto surgió?
background.
Bueno, tuvo antecedentes
First,
el ICH
the
en su
ICH
formación.
standard
En la década del 80,
was
en
first
la Comunidad
established during
Europea
the
se movió
80s.
hacia el
The
desarrollo
European
de un
community
mercado
moved
único
towards the
para
development
productos
of a unique market
farmacéuticos.
for
Ya en el año
pharmaceutical
89,
products.
entonces, Europa, Japón
In
y los Estados Unidos
the
comenzaron a establecer
1989,
bases
Europe
para
and
armonizar
Japan
los
and the
distintos
US
aspectos
established
de la
a
regulación
foundation, a
del desarrollo
baseline
de
for
medicamentos.
harmonization
Y en
involving
1989,
the
en la
development of these
conferencia de la Organización
medications.
Mundial de la
And
Salud,
in
ICRA, de
1989,
autoridades regulatorias
during the
medicamentosos
WHO
de
conference for
OMS,
regulatory
comenzó a
authorities in the field of
materializarse
medication,
esa
we began to make
armonización.
plans for
Desde
specific
1990 ha
actions to
evolucionado
harmonize all of this information.
constantemente la
This,
actividad que
however,
de
has
manera
evolved over
significativa
time.
requirió un
During
progreso
the first
significativo en el
decade, we
desarrollo
saw
de
significant
guías
progress in the
sobre temas de
development of guidelines related to safety, quality, effectiveness, and other factors that we put under the category of multidisciplinary. And this included MEDRA and the common technical document for the RNs. In the second decade, we saw efforts converging on the implementation of the guidelines of the ICH in the ICH regions and the diffusion to non-member regions. After this, we extended the harmonization beyond the founding regions for ICH, and the idea was to expand the international scope that could involve other parts of the world. And you can see here that these are the current members of ICH. On the left-hand column, you can see the founding members as well as the regulatory members. And on the right side column, you can see the standing observers. And so we could say that in Brazil, in addition to Argentina, Mexico, we have current Latin American countries members of the regulatory group. And then Peru, Colombia are currently registered as observing members. So the WHO, in their efforts for harmonization, has included these countries as observers, and they have also adopted these standards for pharmacological regulation in those countries. The International Council for the Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceutical Products established 27 guides for the different stages, quality guides, there are 26 in total, safety guidelines, the number 16, effectiveness, which number 23, and multidisciplinary, which number 12. They also established electronic standards for regulatory information transference, and it also established the standardized medical terminology. It's important to point out that each document was developed over several phases. Each document had to go through the construction, consensus process to become a technical document. The second phase involved the confirmation of the consensus and the adoption of the draft. Stage 3, consult and discussion, and then implementation and adoption. There are a number of other documents that you need to become familiar with, which includes the assessment of clinical trials. One of the main documents is the general considerations for clinical studies document, the E8, which I will discuss a little bit in the next slide, but we also have others, such as the safety data management document, how clinical studies results need to be presented, different ethnic factors, geriatric studies, statistical principles, pediatric studies, and the multi-regional clinical trials, as well as the factors that need to be considered for the development of these documents. Therefore, these guidelines for good clinical practices allow us to avail ourselves of multi-regional data, in that way avoiding any redundancy, not having to conduct individual studies at the country level, but rather access many studies that exist and have been conducted at the international level. And these involve the design, the execution, monitoring, audits, recording, and analysis, and reporting for these clinical styles for the purposes of uploading them into the record. It established parameters for the creation of other credible data, as well as precise and reliable data. It affords us the ability to avoid repetitions and expedites the development time. So when we establish these parameters to create reliable, accurate data, it allows us to avoid any redundancies. Now, we did go through various phases for these guidelines. When the first guidelines were published, it first described the responsibilities for researchers and sponsors, and it included sections for essential documents and pamphlets for researchers. And the second version, E6R2, that was issued in 2016, updated the standards for electronic records. But what we have now brings a new principle for quality related to design. So this is the ICHR3, which is made up of a document that has been adopted since January 2025, which is guideline E6R3, and it also has an attachment, Annex number 2, that is currently undergoing a public consultation period. Now, in terms of some general changes, I'll be talking about the details later on, but this new standard has a new structure with a better definition for the scope, outlined both in Annex 1 and Annex 2. And it incorporates innovative methods that can be used for the development of these clinical trials. And this includes pragmatic studies, world data that we've already mentioned. And what's key here is that it establishes this design quality and focus aspect. Considering all the risks, it also incorporates the new technologies as part of the process. And it also focuses extensively on transparency in the record keeping and the publication of results. And we will discuss this and delve more deeply into this. So the table of contents includes an introduction, the principles. Some of the principles have been reviewed and revised and expanded. And we also have Annex 1, which addresses the responsibilities of the Ethical Responsibility Committee. And it also incorporates a chapter on data governance, and that is a subset of guidelines that addresses the responsibilities and roles of sponsors and other stakeholders, and that also has appendices, and the necessary requirements for executing clinical trials, and it's all followed up by a glossary. Now, what significant changes do we see in this latest version of the document? First and foremost, we have some changes and amendments in the principles. We've seen some changes in the responsibilities of researchers and sponsors, in data governance, which is a new chapter with essential records and the glossary. And additionally, it also has some changes in the protocol and some amendments in the annex for the researcher manual and for the establishment of committees. We also have new principles. Principle number 7 discusses the topic of proportionality, that the focus on the safety of the participant and the reliability of the results need to be based on the associated risks involved in participating in the trial. There has to be a consideration for the potential risk that the trial poses for participants. Principle 10 refers to responsibilities. It clarifies the transfer of activities by the sponsor and the delegation by the researcher. So it also addresses the necessary agreements for this delegation of functions. And lastly, it discusses adequate supervision aspects. Some of the principles that were reviewed include ethical principles, and we see the need to not exclude unnecessarily any particular populations of participants. And this is part of the context in which we have to develop these clinical trial documents with certain minimal requirements. When we talk about pregnant women, for example, we have a guideline or a subset of guidelines that's currently being developed for that population. We need to have informed consent, which in principle needs to include the concept of the process involving informed consent, where it points out and emphasizes the process. In the review by the Ethics Committee, it was established that periodic review was necessary for the various applicable regulatory requirements. It also talks about the periodic review of the scientific knowledge and the focus to determine whether or not any modifications in the trial are necessary. And lastly, this is a critical guideline or subset of guidelines. It's not necessarily rigid. So we may need individuals with different levels of expertise at different stages of the clinical trial to be involved in this, depending on the risk associated with the trial. And we also need to delegate responsibilities to those individuals. Among the principles that were reviewed, we looked at quality, and this involved a systematic focus on the quality and quantity of information generated. From the outset of the development of a clinical trial, there has to be a proactive establishment of quality parameters, and additionally, we need to establish the risk associated with the process or the key aspects that we are focusing the study on. There's also a principle of data governance, and all of these trial processes need to support the key objectives of the trial. They need to be properly supervised and controlled for proper record keeping, and we need to have effective data management. In terms of the principle of transparency, this implies not necessarily just publishing the clinical trial results, but we also need to publish the entirety of the clinical trial study. Lastly, we looked at some aspects related to how the finished product stemming from the research can be managed. And we need to ensure that when we talk about participants, regardless of whether where the study is being taken or conducted, the quality parameters have to be in full compliance, especially as it relates to providing participants with the information. Now, for the roles of the researcher, we have seen some changes. When we talk about informed consent, it discusses different methods to provide information through videos, through written materials, or other interactive methods, tablets, or what have you. But it always discusses the need that if participants are not necessarily up to date on electronic methods of providing information, then we need to resort to written materials to provide the information that's required and acquire the informed consent. We need to also provide for the possibility of remote informed consent, and we always need to have the paper alternative in the absence of any electronic alternative.
Habla del asentimiento informado, ¿está bien?
It also
Y
speaks
de las
of
condiciones
informed consent and indicates the required conditions.
También algunos puntos importantes.
other
nueva
important
información que hay en una
items is
enmienda
that
al
the
formulario
new
de
information in an amendment
consentimiento
to
informado
the informed consent document
se debe considerar
must be
siempre, por ejemplo,
taken
dependiendo de la
into
etapa del
account,
ensayo, si es
depending on when
relevante
it takes
para
place during the
cambiar el
study,
consentimiento
to see if it is
informado. Y
pertinent and see how it
también
affects the informed
habla
consent.
de que esta nueva
There's
información,
also
si se cambia el
mentioned
consentimiento
that the
informado,
new
porque es
information, if it
relevante,
affects the informed consent status,
relevante, entonces debe
that
estar
it's not just
claramente
administrative,
identificada,
that it
porque a
is
veces
pertinent, it has
se
to be
pierde esa nueva
clearly
información
indicated.
en
At times that
consentimientos de
information can
16,
fall
17
between the
páginas,
the
entonces
cracks
el
if there's a
participante
16 or 17-page
no
document.
identifica cuál es esta nueva
It may not be
información
possible for the
dentro
participant
de
to
los materiales
catch this new information when looking at
que explican
the
sobre
materials explaining
en
the
relación a
process.
las responsabilidades,
Now, turning
se
to
aclararon las
responsibilities,
expectativas entre el patrocinador y el investigador de
expectations
acuerdo a cómo
for
deben
the
manejar los
sponsor and the
proveedores de
investigator
servicios, los
were
acuerdos, la
clarified
responsabilidad
in
final
terms
del
of how
patrocinador y el investigador
they
con respecto
relate
a
to the
esto, la
service providers
supervisión
and their
del
relationship.
investigador
Also,
sobre las
there's
actividades delegadas no
information
solamente
about
en su
how
oficina, sino en estos
investigators should be
proveedores de
supervised
servicios si
when it
él
comes to
los contrata
delegated
y del
activities.
patrocinador asimismo
It also indicates the
estos
sponsor's
proveedores de servicios.
role
Y
vis-a-vis
también
the
se
service
aclararon cuáles
providers.
son los requisitos
And there's
de
also a
documentación de
clarification
la
of
delegación de funciones.
how to document the delegation of functions.
Con respecto a la gestión del producto de
Now,
investigación,
turning
un
to
punto en el punto
managing
2.10.8 de la
the
guía establece que este
product,
producto puede ser enviado a la
2.10.8
ubicación donde esté el
indicates that the product may
participante
be
o
sent
dispensado en una
to the
ubicación
location where
más
the
cercana del
participant
participante, por
is,
ejemplo, una
or
farmacia local si fuera un producto
to
aprobado,
a nearby
un
location,
centro de
depending
salud
on where they're
local.
located,
Pero
using
ya
pharmacies or
cuando
local
adquiere
health
el producto de
centers.
investigación, tiene
But
que siempre
the
mantener la
investigation
calidad
product must
del producto de investigación y para esto entonces
always come
deberá
with
el
clear
patrocinador
information,
y el
and to that
investigador
end,
tener las
the
guías
sponsor and the
necesarias
investigator must
para
have
mantener esta
the
calidad.
necessary information in order
Con
to
respecto al
preserve quality.
patrocinador,
Now, turning to the
algunos
sponsor,
cambios importantes.
there
Lo
have been
primero,
some
se debe
significant
implementar
changes.
calidad
First,
por diseño
that
desde
the
el
sponsor
inicio
must
del
implement
ensayo
quality
clínico.
by
Esto
design
es,
since
¿qué
the
es calidad por
outset
diseño? Es
of the clinical
un
study. Now,
enfoque
what is quality by
sistemático
design?
que
It is
dice,
a
bueno, desde el
systematic
inicio,
approach
ya desde la
which states that from
fabricación,
the
desde el
very
diseño del
beginning,
ensayo
from the
clínico, desde la
manufacturer,
conducción
from
del
the
ensayo
design of the
clínico,
clinical
todas
study,
las etapas
at all
proactivamente
stages in the
se deben
process,
establecer los parámetros de calidad
there
para
must be clear
no ir
quality
a
parameters,
cuando surge el problema.
and there must be a
Proactivamente
proactive
establecer
approach,
y con
not
un
wait
enfoque
until a
crítico.
problem
Siempre decir
emerges.
cuáles son las
It is
etapas
important to
críticas
spell
en las
out
que
the
más
critical
debe
steps
fijarse para poder hacer
when quality must be
enfoque. Por otra
considered.
parte, se
Also,
habla de considerar los
there's
aportes de las
reference
partes
to
interesadas, los
contributing the
profesionales de
input of
salud,
interested
las
interested
asociaciones de
parties or
pacientes,
stakeholders, health
¿está bien?
care professionals,
Los
also patient
diseños y
associations,
evitar cargas innecesarias a los
and
participantes y
avoid
a los
undue
investigadores con
pressure
tareas
on participants or
hipercomplicadas que a
investigators
veces
by assigning
no
them
ayudan
highly
a el buen
complicated tasks
desarrollo
that
del
do not
estudio.
contribute to the
Y
study's outcome.
finalmente,
And finally,
en este sentido, vamos a ver acá que se
as
aclaran
you can see here,
procesos
there's
de
also a clear
lo que es
definition
el control
of
de
the
calidad y el
process to be used
aseguramiento de
for quality
calidad,
control purposes and also for
particularmente
quality assurance
se aclaran
purposes.
procesos del monitoreo centralizado
We see
de
centralized
en qué
monitoring
momentos se
as
puede
one of the
hacer, cómo se
requirements,
debe hacer, qué
when and how
condiciones
it should be
debe
done,
tener
also what
y que la
conditions must be
estrategia del
followed.
monitoreo debe
And also it
considerar el
says that the
propósito
monitoring
del
strategy
ensayo, el
must also
diseño, el
consider the purpose
fundamento,
of the
el
study, the
perfil de
design,
seguridad y los
also
puntos
the safety
finales,
profile,
pero siempre con
and
un
the
enfoque
endpoints,
basado en
but
el riesgo.
always following a
Entonces,
risk-based
enfatiza este
approach.
concepto de manejo del
It
riesgo,
also
cómo
emphasizes the
identificarlo,
risk
la
management
evaluación,
concepts, how to
el
identify
control, las
them,
medidas
assess
para el
them,
control de este
control them,
riesgo, a
what
quién y
measures
cómo
can be
se debe
used,
comunicar,
also
se
how
debe
that risk should be
revisar
communicated,
permanentemente
how it
esto
There should be an ongoing review of risks and how they should be reported. Lastly, the guide sets requirements for computer systems and also for data management systems. They must be fit for purpose and throughout, and they must be applied during the entire life cycle of the data. There's also requirements related to the completion of the data sets and with programming, statistics, and analysis. There are a few annexes, and these have changed as well. Essential records, for example, there's guidance on what constitutes an essential record and how these should be handled. There's also an indication that the nature and scope of the generated and maintained records will depend on the study design and will follow a risk-based and proportional approach. There's also a reference to the protocol and how it should include ranges that are acceptable for its individual provisions, thereby reducing the number of deviations or also the need to add amendments. We must stress the need for simplicity and clarity of protocols and also expand the statistical sections based on the new adaptive designs and include everything having to do with the Bayesian designs. There's also an investigator's manual, which must include identified adverse reactions as well as reference safety information, specifying their frequency and their nature. In the glossary, we have some new terms. For example, data acquisition tool, service provider, which is referenced often, and metadata. These are the contextual data that make it possible to understand data elements. It's like a snapshot. If you have a photograph, the date for that photograph, when it was taken, and also there has to be an indication of the speed, etc. So contextual data that make it possible for the user to understand the final data. Some differences were, rather definitions were updated.
Justamente estas actividades que se hacen en entornos descentralizados.
For example, the investigator location, there's no reference to subjects anymore. These are now participants, and there are a few others. There's a chapter on data governance. In this chapter, a number of key processes were defined, processes which should be applied throughout the data lifecycle. This includes data protection, also managing computerized data system, also randomization, dosage adjustment, and blinding of studies. Also processes that are key for decision-making that are reviewed by the data monitoring committee, also blinding or unblinding data and other IDMC activities. This covers the entire cycle involving data capture, data review, data conversion, how they're transferred, how they're finalized, how the database is finalized, how they're going to be stored and or destroyed. Annex 2, it addresses good clinical practice considerations that stem from the growing use of innovative design and data source elements. So it provides additional considerations. Real world data versus decentralized elements. It also looks at pragmatic elements. It follows the same structure as the previous one, but it applies to innovative design, specifically real world data are data related, data collected during clinical practice without a given intervention. They may come from electronic files, surveys, records or even claims related to service delivery. And real-world evidence come from the analysis of real-world data. So by definition, mostly come from data that are already available commercially, but it's important to mention that investigation products may include real-world data, for example, in the framework of programs for compassionate care. This is the type of data that was used. Now, what real-world data can give rise to a regulatory decision? For example, studies that use real-world data to capture clinical results having to do with safety and efficacy. Also, when the studies are used to complete or complement a control exercise. Also, the single-arm trials, as they're called now, to look at historical data related to a disease or population. Also, observational studies to meet a post-marketing requirement or to introduce changes in an approved product. The decentralized elements are the activities that are related with the trial, which are carried out away from the investigator's location, be it in the homes of participants, at a local healthcare center, at mobile medical units, or data that are acquired but used remotely using digital health technologies. And finally, we have pragmatic element. These are data that relate to clinical practice aspects, such as simplified protocols for the optimized collection of data. The two types of data may be included here. Data generated specifically for the trial, these are primary data, but there could also be data from external sources that are gathered for other purposes, and they're used as secondary data in the study. So to conclude my presentation, I have a few additional points. These are from Annex 2. This is publicly available. You can come in and add your comments. These elements have to do with the supervision of the indicator, which depend on the nature of the activities and also how proportional they are to the importance of data being collected and the risks. Also, safety information, which comes from different sources, from nurses, home visits, remote visits, also clinical history. Informed consent must be adapted depending on whether they're decentralized or pragmatic elements. There must always be informed consent. It should be a requirement, even if real-world data are being tapped. Now, how the investigation product is managed, it may be provided to the participant or to an individual designated by the participant and to be handled in the participant's home. This means that confidentiality has to be protected, must comply with all quality standards. Also, look at the complexity and route for administration, also the information available to those who are participating, and all of this has to be supervised by the investigator. And lastly, the approaches for the product management must be organized and executed in compliance with applicable requirements. And still, this is what applies to innovative designs. Now, for the sponsor, in the case of these new innovative designs, it is important to consider that data will be received by the sponsor from different sources using different terminologies and or standards, given that there could be multiple sources. And it's important to take into account this lack of standardization and how the data is going to be handled. What will happen with data that may be missing? data that has not been captured, and the overall quality of data and tools. It is important to establish mechanisms to ensure that the data will continue to be accurate, that their integrity will be protected, and as well as their traceability, since this is a requirement for a clinical trial. There's something else to be considered, and it's that the data used as part of the trial may be the property of or may be under the control of other entities other than the sponsor. So it should be possible to obtain clearance to access those data sources when this is the case. And then some final aspects relate to the ethics committee. The sponsor must provide the information required for the proper assessment of these different operational approaches with these innovative designs, and always obtain consent or permission to use real-world data. Now, turning to the management of the investigation product, it's important to manage the product so that if it is used remotely, due consideration is given to storage, preparation, management, access, and knowledge of individuals of the safety profile, the need to have a safety profile, also to make sure that there's a clear understanding of processes to ensure that the product has been delivered to participants and that it has the proper quality and was properly managed. Finally, as part of these pragmatic or decentralized studies, it is important to also ensure that the security studies are properly captured, that there's an approach to manage security, which includes actions to safeguard the data. In conclusion, ICH E6 R3 and Annex 2 include many valuable inputs related to good clinical practice. I'm going to mention 4, but there are many others. It includes the quality by design concept, which had already been included under ICH E8. That was the first time it was included. It also includes proportionality and risk-based approaches, paying special attention to factors that are critical for the quality of the clinical trial. It also includes learning from innovative designs in clinical studies and addressing or taking into account lessons learned from public health emergencies, and it also fosters transparency through the use of clinical trial records, notification of results, non-exclusion of specific population, and emphasizes the need to have a IC process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias
Thank
por
you
una exposición tan
very much
detallada,
for such a
Patricia.
detailed presentation, Patricia.
Realmente el volumen del contenido es bastante
The wealth
notable.
of information is
Vamos a tener la oportunidad de
significant.
discutir
We
esto,
will have a chance to
posteriormente.
discuss that,
Luego de la
to discuss this
participación
a bit
de
later,
dos panelistas que nos acompañan
after
el
we
día
hear
de
from the
hoy.
2 other
Quiero
panelists who are with
invitar a
us
Laura
today.
Traversi
I'd like to
de
invite
Argentina. Ella
Laura
es pediatra,
Traversi of
farmacóloga
Argentina, who's a
clínica y
pediatrician,
magíster en
a clinical
investigación clínica
pharmacologist, and also
farmacológica. Actualmente
specializes
ella
in
es jefa del
clinical and
Departamento de
pharmacological
Ensayos
research. She is
Clínicos
the head of
de
the
la
clinical
Dirección de Investigación
trials
Clínica y
division in
Gestión
the
del
unit
Registro de
of clinical
Medicamentos de
research
ANMAT.
and registry of drugs under ANMAT,
Adelante,
or in
Laura.
ANMAT,
Gracias por
rather.
estar con
Go
nosotros el
ahead,
día de hoy.
Laura, and thank you for being with us today. Hello, good morning to everyone. At the outset, let me thank you for the invitation to be a part of this webinar. I'll be sharing my presentation.
¿Se puede ver ahí?
Can you see it?
¿La pueden ver?
Perfecto. Gracias, Laura.
Yes, it's fine. Thank you, Laura.
Bueno, Voy a presentar cómo va a ser o cómo tenemos pensada la
I
implementación
will be
de la
describing
guideline
how we
6
intend to
ICH-93 de buenas
implement
prácticas clínicas
Guideline
en
ICH
Argentina por parte de
E63
nuestra
on
agencia
good clinical
regulatoria.
practices in Argentina.
Nosotros visualizamos y analizamos la transición para la
We
implementación de esta
analyze the
guía en
transition
constante
for
interacción con los diferentes
implementing
actores
this
de la
guideline
investigación clínica,
in
ya que nuestra
conjunction with different
retroalimentación
players
optimiza y hace
because
ver, digamos, lo
we
que es la
aim
ciencia
to
regulada,
optimize
y la visualizamos en distintas
regulated
etapas,
science, and we
que
look at
son
different
las que le voy a
steps,
mencionar a
which I
continuación:
will
un
go over.
análisis de la
One
brecha
is
de las
a
normas y
gap
los procesos que
analysis of
tenemos en
norms and
Argentina con
procedures
respecto
in place
a
in
lo que
Argentina
viene a implementar o a
vis-a-vis what would be
modificar esta guía
called
en esta nueva
for
versión de ICH.
under the new
Hace
ICH
tiempo nosotros
guideline.
estamos trabajando en una actualización de la
For a while now,
normativa,
we've been
así que
working
una
on
actualización que
updating our
incorpore
standards, and the
requisitos
idea is to
que los requisitos que
include
sean necesarios y que sean
the
incorporados de la
new
versión del
requirements
ICH,
stemming from the
actualización de
ICH
los procedimientos
version,
operativos
also
estándar,
updating
las
of
modificaciones de la normativa
standard
y el
procedures in addition to
entendimiento de
changing
todos los
the
actores para
standards or
asegurar
regulations
que esta
themselves, and also
implementación
provide
gradual se
training
pueda llevar a cabo
to
y se
all
realice
players to make
eficientemente.
sure that
Estas
we can
etapas
carry out
son
this
dinámicas,
implementation
muchas veces se
successfully.
pueden
These steps or
superponer o
stages
uno
are
reestructurar
dynamic.
alguna y después volver a la anterior, pero lo
We do
hicimos
not
preferencialmente
necessarily
de
have to
manera
follow them
dinámica,
in
de cierta
sequence. We
manera
can go to one,
didáctica,
move on to
de
the other,
manera
and
que se
come
puedan
back.
aprender.
The idea is to have a dynamic
Con
process.
respecto a la normativa, la Argentina,
As far as
actualmente en la Argentina,
the
la disposición
regulations in Argentina
6677
currently
es la
have
vigente
provision
desde el 2010 y es
6677,
nuestra norma
which is
base,
current still
que se
since
alinea con guías
2010.
internacionales
It
sin
is
perder
aligned with
el
the
marco
international
específico como
guidelines,
tal de
but
nuestro país.
applies to the specific
Argentina es
context in
miembro
our
de ICH
country.
desde junio del
Argentina has been a member
2024,
of ICH
y
since
fue
June of
con esta normativa que
2024,
nosotros pudimos alinearnos
and
y
this
formar parte y ser miembros
guideline
de
made it possible
ICH.
for us to
Es
join
decir,
and
esta
align
norma
ourselves with
está
the ICH
alineada a la
requirements.
versión
So
anterior de las guías
it is
ICH.
aligned with prior
De la
ICH
norma actual, nosotros lo que
guidelines.
observamos como una
What we
brecha
see in the current guideline, one of
principalmente
the
corresponden
gaps
a
we have
tres
found
puntos
relates to
fundamentales.
3
Por
points
un lado, la
primarily.
proporcionalidad, el
One
principio de
is
proporcionalidad basada en
the
riesgo que ya
principle of
mencionó Patricia,
risk-based proportionality,
la
already
gobernanza de
mentioned by
datos y
Patricia,
lo que tiene que ver
data
con los
governance,
roles y
and the
responsabilidades.
various roles
Este
and
último punto no
responsibilities.
los vamos a detallar
We will
específicamente
not
en el
delve
tiempo de nuestra
into
presentación,
the
dado
latter
que
points
ya
during
se
the
toca
presentation
cuando lo voy a ir
because
tocando a medida
I
que vaya
will be
presentando los
addressing
primeros
it
puntos.
as I present the first two. So the
Con
last
respecto a
one,
la
I will not
proporcionalidad
delve
basada en
into.
riesgo, nos parece
On
importante
risk-based
definir,
proportionality, we think it is
operativizar y
important to
aplicar este
define,
enfoque en la actualización de la normativa
develop,
que
and
nosotros hagamos
apply
para todos los
this
procesos, desde la
approach
evaluación hasta
in
la
all
fiscalización.
regulations for all
Es decir, que sea una
processes from
gestión basada en
evaluation
riesgo desde
to
que se
enforcement.
inicia la
We have a
solicitud de iniciación de los
risk-based
estudios,
management process in
en esto
place,
se puede
starting with
aplicar
the
la
request
diferenciación y
for authorization to
monitorización
conduct
basada en
studies,
riesgo,
and
aplicarla también a la
it
vigilancia,
should
según
also be
solicitud de
applied to
informes y
surveillance,
entrevistas,
and this
y
means
aplicarla también en las
requests for
inspecciones. Nosotros
reports,
en la
interviews,
normativa
and
actual tenemos, por
inspections.
ejemplo, criterios
Under
de
the current
riesgo establecidos,
standard, we
por
have
ejemplo, para la selección de
risk
inspecciones que más
criteria
adelante
for
mencionaré
inspections and how they
inspecciones,
should be conducted.
pero nos parece
But
importante
we
ya
think it
hacerlo de
is
manera
important to
sistemática
start
y
applying this more
cobijado en todos los
systematically.
procesos, desde el
And
principio
this
hasta
should
la
be the case for
finalización
all
del proceso.
processes,
Y esto, como dije
from the
anteriormente, con la
request to the
participación
completion
y
of the
interacción de
trial.
todas las partes
And this
involucradas.
should
Es decir,
involve
esto
all
sería la ANAP y
stakeholders
todos los
and
actores
their
involucrados.
interactions. So that means ANAP
¿Cuáles
and
son los
all
actores que nosotros
the
definimos
stakeholders it
con los
works
que
with.
queremos trabajar para la implementación de
Who are the
nuestra guía?
stakeholders we want to
En
work with
principio, los
in applying the
participantes,
new
los
guideline? First,
investigadores y
participants.
centros
Secondly,
de investigación,
investigators and
los comités de
research
ética,
centers,
los patrocinadores de los
ethics
estudios, y
committees,
incorporamos también
study
un nuevo rol
sponsors,
que
and
son los
we also
expertos, que
included
si
a
bien
new role,
desde
that of
ANMAT, desde
the
el Departamento de
experts.
Ensayos Clínicos, nosotros hacemos
ANPAT,
consultas a expertos
ANMAT, and our
internos, es decir,
clinical
otros servicios, otros
department
departamentos que
does
vienen
tap other
de
departments and
distintas
other
disciplinas.
experts in other
También nos parece
disciplines.
importante
We
incorporar
think it is important
la
to
mirada de
add
expertos externos e
the
independientes en
opinions
caso
of
de ser necesario.
independent and external experts when
Nosotros, la
required.
proporcionalidad basada en riesgo, nos parece
Risk-based
importante
proportionality,
definir e identificar
we
cuáles son
think,
los riesgos, las señales de riesgo y
should
cuáles van a
include the
ser las
definition
medidas
and
que podemos aplicar
identification
para
of risks
su
and
mitigación.
how they
Y
can
esto
be
en todo el
mitigated,
ecosistema de la
spelling
investigación.
out the
Todos los
measures, and this should be the
participantes
case for the
es
entire
fundamental
ecosystem.
documentar
starting with the participants. We should encourage their informed and active participation, and this works both ways. So we should receive the feedback of the population under study, and we, on our side, should also provide the participants with the information they need for decision-making purposes. We think this could be considered a risk criterion. As for the research centers and investigators, we believe that it is important to stress quality. There should also be a risk-based approach. We need to consider the importance of having operational procedures in place. We currently have a regulation which applies to phase 1 for centers conducting phase 1 studies, and this includes a series of operational procedures, for example, how to handle emergencies. And all of this could be based on risk criteria, considering the purpose of a phase 1 study and the risks it could entail. But this could also include other risk-based criteria. Then we think that for the centers and for the investigators, it is important to look at the time available to them and their teams. In Argentina, physicians are overburdened. They have many tasks, not just providing healthcare. They interview patients and participants. They have to do this work in addition to the work they normally do. In the case of clinical research, the doctors are the ones who have to obtain informed consent. In some countries, it could be done by nurses or other health personnel. In our country, it has to be done by the physicians. So it means that they also have the additional tasks. So if you have a physician or an investigator who's working on several clinical trials, that person is responsible for all these tasks, and the individual and the team must have the time to conduct the trial. So this is another risk factor. It's also important to make sure that there are sufficient and trained human resources. We need to consider their research experience at different levels. We need to look at the characteristic of the population using the center. Some may be referral centers, may be dealing with populations that are fairly dispersed. Argentina is a large country, so we need to consider distance and whether it's a factor in compliance with the protocol. So all of this is part of the analysis we need to carry out with the researchers and the centers. In Argentina, we also have different infrastructure and technology levels. So we need to make sure that the levels available are appropriate for what is being proposed in the trials. Ethics committees, they must have risk-based quality management, and they also need to consider the impact of their standards and procedures given the new version of the guideline. In the case of sponsors, they also have to have a risk-based quality management. As per ICH, some elements are cross-cutting and general, which meaning they apply to all countries. In Argentina, there's some specific features we need to consider which may be unique to our country. In recent years, clinical pharmacological research has grown. So we have seen emergence of new sponsors, and we need to consider the experience or training, the expertise they may have, also the human resources they have, make sure that they're adequate in terms of number and training. It's also important to assess the research centers and their qualifications for training, their expertise. Distance is also a factor, as I said before, looking at the different inputs and whether they need to have in-person interviews. So it's important to consider where the centers and the patients are located. As for records, we have different record-keeping systems. In some cases, they may be electronic and more advanced. And they will vary depending on the level or standards. So it's an important factor to take into account as well. And then there's also the population that is part of the study. Then we think it's important to work with experts committee in order to reach agreement on the risk criteria to be applied. Then data governance. We think it is important to define, implement, and apply the data governance approach throughout all the processes. We need to have regulations in place that consider the entire data lifecycle, ensuring proper handling, and have clear criteria for validation and traceability of electronic records, also address security and cybersecurity. These may not be spelled out in the current regulations and may need to be upgraded. Then there's also data storage, long-term access, integration of different data sources, and also how to manage data that may be missing.
This is applicable, as I mentioned previously, as part of the entire research process for all of the stakeholders. And we need to develop policies that will consider the legality, safety, security, and privacy of data. We have some legislation in different countries related to the protection of personal data, and that applies to electronic systems and clinical recording systems. But it's important for us to ensure standards and requirements in clinical trials that we will need to be in full compliance with what the guidelines establish. In terms of the participants in data generation, we believe it's important for there to be participation in local validation of the various tools to assess the accessibility. Consider that in many cases, there are participants that don't have access, such as internet or other systems. And if the protocol requires this, we need to ensure that this won't be an obstacle to include these participants. That needs to be considered in order to not leave anybody behind when it comes to the research. This requires training, the proper management of data. Who do we talk to if one of the systems fails or if one of the tools fails? We need to ensure proper traceability, the proper training, and proper security and safety for personal information. For participants, we need to ensure that the population is properly represented in all clinical trials conducted in our countries. When we talk about researchers and centers, when we talk about data governance, we need to have proper training at all levels of the organization on how to manage data and store data. In Argentina, we have different levels of complexity. When we talk about data files, we don't have a single unifying standard for the entire country. So this is something that we need to consider. Another thing is the diversity in the IP or computer management capability as well as the infrastructure. When we talk about ethics committees, we have different levels of complexities related to IT systems and human resources in terms of training, and all of the ethics committees in Argentina are accredited because this is something that the authorities have ensured. But regardless, there can be different levels of skill and experience, and this then becomes a more complex situation and more exposed to risk. When we talk about human resources, we need to ensure proper training for all of the personnel involved. Regarding important key stakeholders, we have to ensure that all IT systems used in the trials are validated and meet the expected local regulatory framework. We need to consider the impact that said systems could have with regard to accuracy, reliability, integrity, availability, and authenticity of the records and the required signatures. So we need to ensure that data that is generated locally is based on the international standards. With experts, we have to achieve consensus and collaborate with the experts through the various expert committees to ensure proper local adaptation to these standards. Now, the current status that we see and what we consider the implementation process involved in these guidelines. We include the gap analysis for standards and processes compared to the current version. We also look at the updating of the standard, which is currently underway. There's a draft document that we are conducting a review of internally. We also have to review, update, and generate new standard operating procedures. Once the standard is approved and authorized, we need to have these in place. And lastly, we have to conduct proper training for all of the stakeholders to ensure gradual implementation of the new standards along with the new technology. Now, we've already conducted by this time the necessary meetings, reviews, revisions, and discussions to ensure that the implementation can be done in the most effective way possible. And once the standard comes in, we will once again have to train all our personnel, not just internally, but the external stakeholders as well. Now, we've talked about local challenges throughout the presentation, and we consider that an important implementation challenge for these guidelines would be to work in a gradual form in a joint manner with all of the stakeholders, taking into account the local context to avoid any demands and unnecessary costs that could discourage innovation and the incorporation of the technological advances. If indeed the mentioned focus is used in the practice, then the challenge is to incorporate it into the standard in an adequate way for the purpose of fostering transparency. Lastly, as a conclusion, the objective innovation as well as the execution of clinical trials guaranteeing protection and safety for the participants and reliability for the data. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much,
Laura.
Laura.
Gracias también por terminar con ese mensaje.
Thank you
que
for
nos
giving
recuerda
us
para
this
qué
message that
hacemos
reminds us
investigación, para qué
why we
hacemos
do
ensayos
research in the
clínicos.
first place, why we do clinical
Quiero
trials
ahora
in the first place.
presentar a
Now
Nicolás
I'd like to
Gutiérrez de
introduce
Chile.
Nicolás Gutierrez from
Nicolás
Chile.
es químico
Nicolás is a
farmacéutico, tiene un diplomado en
chemist and
investigación clínica
pharmacologist.
y un
He has
certificado de monitor de ensayos
degrees
clínicos
in
y actualmente
pharmacological
es jefe
research
de la
and
sección de
is
estudios
currently the
clínicos que
chief of the
pertenece al
clinical trials
subdepartamento de
section
autorizaciones
of
y
the
registro de
Department
productos
of
farmacéuticos
Authorization
nuevos y
and
biológicos del
Registration of
Departamento de la
Pharmacological
Agencia
Products.
Nacional de Medicamentos,
All this from
ANAMED,
the
y parte del
National
Instituto de Salud Pública de Chile.
Authority for Medication,
Nicolás,
ANAMED,
muchas
in
gracias por
Chile.
estar con
Nicolás,
nosotros.
thank
Te
you
doy
very
la
much for
palabra.
joining us today. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Carla.
Thank you very much,
Perdón, y antes de
Carla. Excuse me. And before you
te
get started,
escucho, y dado que eres chileno, voy a agregar, por favor, no hables muy
I can hear
rápido,
you,
porque
but
los
given the
traductores
fact that you
tienen
are Chilean, please
a
do not
veces les
speak too
cuesta
rapidly
con
because
la velocidad de
sometimes
traducción, ¿no?
the
Gracias.
interpreters have trouble with
Perfecto.
people
Trataremos de
talking
ir al
too fast.
contrario
Very good.
del chileno típico, que hablamos
Let's
muy rápido.
try to get away from
Bueno,
the
muchas
typical
gracias
Chilean
nuevamente,
speak.
Carla,
Very good.
Patricia, ¿cierto?
Once
Quien
again,
nos
Carla
representó
and
inicialmente,
Patricia, thank you so
servidor,
much.
También Sara, ¿cierto? De OPS, por esta invitación.
Folks from PAHO for the
Entonces,
invitation to take part in this webinar.
Vamos a presentar.
So let's go ahead and share my presentation.
Ahí me avisan si se ve la presentación.
Can you tell me if you can see
Se
my
ve, solo falta
presentation?
que la pongas en
We
modalidad
Can't
presentación.
see it, but can you put it in
Ahí está,
slideshow?
perfecto. Gracias,
Very good.
Nicolás.
Thank you. Thank you,
Ya,
Nicolás.
se ve entonces pantalla completa.
So you can see the full screen now?
Bien.
Very good.
Bueno, entonces, en este seminario, ¿cierto? Virtual de
So in this
OPS, vamos a
webinar,
hablar de los desafíos
sponsored from PAHO, we're going to talk about challenges related to the new standard ICH E6R3.
Primero, y esto
First,
voy un poco más rápido, ¿cierto? Ya se ha mencionado bastante por parte de
we've
Patricia y
already
Laura.
seen this mentioned by
Lo antecedente
Patricia
es
and Laura.
las versiones, ¿cierto? Que anteceden a la ICH
When we talked about the
E6R3.
background
Primero,
for this
¿cierto? La
new
actual
version of the
E6, la
standard,
E6,
this is now
la primera versión,
E6,
que
the most recent
describió
version,
las responsabilidades de
which
investigadores,
describes the responsibilities
patrocinadores,
associated with
investigadoras de partes interesadas
researchers,
en la coordinación de
sponsors, and
clínicos,
other personnel
para todo lo que tiene que ver con
involved in clinical trials.
monitorización,
And this
reporte,
includes
archivo
the
con productos farmacéuticos.
expectations, monitoring,
También los
reporting, and
documentos de
archiving of
entre ellos
clinical
también los
trials
ejemplos
and
de
other
clinical
essential elements and
trial.
documents.
La E6R2, establecida ya en el año
E6R2,
2016,
which is
y
established in
que introdujo algunos de
2016,
los
introduced
conceptos
some new
en
concepts
general y
in
digamos,
general
estándares actualizados de registros
and
electrónicos.
updated
Y en la
standards
versión
for
actual, ya desde
electronic
enero
records.
de
And
este
in the
año,
most recent version that was
digamos, está basada
adopted
lo
in
que es
January of this
internacional
year,
de calidad por diseño o
we are
calidades de
focusing
diseño,
this
Quality by
on
Design,
the foundational
como ya
principle of
mencionaba
quality
al
by
inicio.
design,
Esto también,
QBD.
esta nueva guía
And this was mentioned by one of the colleagues previously, and it involves extensive critical thinking throughout the entire process from the outset. The protocols, it utilizes proportional risk-based approaches, and it focuses extensively on risk. And it recognizes that this is not a one-size-fits-all circumstance.
Bueno, en cuanto a, también mencionó que
We talk
esta versión
about the
R3 está
ICH.
basada en gran
This
parte
most
en
recent version is
la guía
based
ICH E8,
to a
que
large
son
extent
consideraciones
on
generales de estudios clínicos,
guideline E8
y como se indica acá,
applied to
y lo
clinical
tomé de la
studies.
presentación oficial de ICH, es que se
And
integra
this
justamente el concepto de Quality by
iteration
Design en el diseño
uses the
y producción de los estudios
quality-based
clínicos.
design
Esto se
principle
aplica en E6.
in the new version. So we
Entonces,
apply
no debe
the
leerse
E6 standard.
aisladamente. O sea, primero
We
tiene que
cannot read
tomarla,
these two, E8 and
revisarse,
E6, in
digamos, todas las
isolation.
partes interesadas en ICH
All of the
E8 y luego llegar a la
stakeholders that
E6R3.
participated in EH
Entonces,
need
bueno,
to
nosotros
take part
como
in the
ISP,
development of
Institución de Salud
E6.
Pública de Chile,
So as an ISP
a fines del año
in public
2022,
health in Chile, towards the end of
propusimos a la
2022,
Unidad de Coordinación Regulatoria de
we
Medicamentos del
proposed
Departamento del Consejo Nacional de Medicamentos,
a project to
MSP,
the
incorporar el tema de
regulatory
traducción y adaptación
coordination
de
for ANAMED to
ICH-E8
incorporate the
en la
issue of
versión
translation and
2022
adaptation
como
to
grupo de trabajo.
ICH-E8 as a
En marzo de
work group.
2023,
In March of
se notificó
2023,
la coordinación de este
we
grupo 1 de
notified
Agenda
the
Regulatoria
group of the
2023, para la cual se
coordinators
realizaron 9
for the
reuniones
regulatory agenda to
GAR
carry
1,
out
¿cierto? Grupo de Agenda Regulatoria, entre abril y
9
agosto de este
meetings
año.
for the GAR1 between the
Participaron
months of
6
April
miembros
and
del
August of
Departamento ANAMED,
2023. We
más
had
la
six,
coordinadora regulatoria,
six
para finalmente
participating
en
members,
diciembre del
as well as the
2023
regulatory
entregar el
coordinator.
informe y el
And by
documento
December
final
2023,
remitido a
we
dirección
issued the
de
report
ISP.
and final document to send
Entonces, ¿en qué
to
resultó
the
esto? En justamente la
department
resolución
head.
exenta número
So this led
0173 del
to
29 de enero de 2024,
exempt resolution
que
number
aprueba la guía de consideraciones generales
0173
para estudios clínicos
2901
y que está
2024
basada justamente en la
that included
ICH,
general considerations for
consideraciones generales
clinical
para
studies.
ensayos clínicos
This included the ICH and
digamos, de
other
octubre del
relevant
año
factors.
2022.
This was based on the
Entonces,
guide
esta
from the
guía está
International
compuesta por
Council
7
for
puntos en el
Harmonization,
anexo
and it
y,
included a
en
number of
resumen,
points in the annex. And
ICH8
in
habla
summary,
de justamente la calidad
ICE8
del diseño o calidad
discusses
por
design
diseño,
quality or
que
quality
en
by
investigación
design
clínica se propone garantizar que la
that
calidad
in
de un estudio se
clinical
impulsa de manera
research
proactiva, diseñando la calidad en el
seeks
protocolo y
to
procesamiento.
ensure the
Entonces, el
quality
principal
of a
foco es en
study
factores
and
críticos
that
para la
it
calidad
be moved forward
para poder
proactively
asegurar,
by
garantizar, ¿cierto?, la
designing
protección de los
the
derechos del
quality in the
bienestar de
protocol
los participantes,
and the study
generación de resultados confiables y
study
significativos.
processes. This
Y
would apply
todo
also
esto
to
considerando
participants.
la
All
gestión
of
de
this in
riesgo de estos
consideration
factores
of
usando
the
un enfoque de
proper
riesgo
risk management
proporcional.
for all of these
Entonces,
factors using the
como
principle of
puntos principales para los
proportionality.
elementos de
So the
diseño del
key
desarrollo
elements
clínico
here for the
que
design to
deben
be
considerarse
considered
desde los objetivos del
and that
estudio,
need to be
que pueden
considered
ser definidos
an
hacia este
objective
área
for the study
para abordar la
need to
pregunta o
be
las
properly
preguntas centrales
defined
principales.
with sufficient clarity
También es
to
relevante
address all of
mencionar
the key issues.
la selección de
It's also
participantes
relevant to
apropiados que
mention
tengan la
the
enfermedad por
selection
diseño o
of
perfil
appropriate
molecular
participants
genético
that
existente o
have the
único.
disease condition
También
or
el uso de
molecular
enfoques para
genetic
minimizar
profile
el
that
sesgo,
is
como
subject to the
categorización,
study.
cegamiento,
On the other hand, we need
ocultamiento,
to use different
control de
approaches to
factores de
minimize
perturbación, etc.
any bias, such as
También que los
randomizing
criterios de valoración,
or
los
blinding
endpoints,
or
como también se conocen,
any
sean bien definidos, medibles,
confusion. Additionally, we need to
significativos y relevantes para los pacientes.
ensure the
Entonces, como
proper
se acordaba,
validation of
establecer
criteria
criterios de
endpoints
valoración
that need to be
difícilmente medibles
well-defined, measurable,
digamos, la
clinically
implementación
significant, and
debe
relevant
ser
for
práctica.
patients. And
Y
other
por último, los criterios
criteria
subjetivos
includes operational criteria such as the study viability and the adequate selection of research centers, the quality of facilities, as well as specialized analytical capacity, as well as evidence and other data. So when we talk about key aspects of ICH E6R3, as mentioned previously, includes adequate language to facilitate innovation in the design of clinical trials, as well as the technology and operational foci. It also needs to establish the framework for practical and viable expectations through the adoption of QBD, quality by design, as well as proportionate approaches based on risk, or the responsibilities of the sponsor and researcher in a clinical trial ecosystem that is currently evolving. Additionally, we want to foster adjusted approaches to the purpose. We need to reflect on the design and the implementation. So we need to look at this from the clinical standpoint. We also need to incorporate the learning of clinical trials design that use innovative approaches as well as lessons learned from public health emergencies. We also want to foster transparency through the recording of clinical trials and proper reporting of results. This is already included in the guidelines for the WHO for various regulatory agencies. There's also an approach to obtain informed consent. This is something that was already addressed. We need to provide adequate advisory and support for this. Finally, we need to update some of the definitions. For example, the investigation or research center to adapt them to the clinical trial operations that are decentralized. Many times we see mixed results with these. Now, some of the main challenges in the implementation includes data governance. This is a new section in R3 that provides guidance to the responsible parties, that is, researchers and the promoter or sponsor, regarding the adequate management and integrity of the data to allow for the proper verification and interpretation of the information related to clinical trials. We need to define the key procedures or processes that need to be addressed throughout the entire data life cycle. This includes data protection, information system management, the activities of the internal data monitoring committee. Additionally, it specifies that procedures need to be focused on the critical aspect or importance of data and must be implemented proportionally and adequately documented. It describes the elements of the data lifecycle from their capture to their destruction. And we need to clarify the meaning of metadata, which is a very interesting and novel concept. As Patricia had mentioned previously, for metadata, it's the necessary contextual information to be able to understand a particular or determinate data element. The metadata are structured information that describes, explains, or facilitates the recovery, the use, or management of data. For this purpose, this guideline related to metadata will be necessary to allow for the adequate evaluation or assessment of the trial execution. So these are the procedures that need to be established to cover the full data life cycle. It includes data capture. This would include relevant metadata, including audit trails. There would be a subsequent review of data and metadata. This would be followed by data corrections. Then we have data transfer, exchange, and migration. And this leads us to a finalization of a data set or data sets prior to analysis. This leads to retention and access. And finally, we have the last stage, which is destruction. And
forma
this
paralela.
also
O sea,
has to have a certain order, or at least a parallel
entonces, los
order.
desafíos en
In
cuanto a
terms
los
of
protocolos de
challenges
verificación
related to
clínica,
research
se
protocols,
destaca entonces
or
la importancia del
research,
protocolo como
clinical
adaptabilidad al
research
mismo,
protocols, we
incluyendo la
have to
evaluación de
highlight the
mejoras
importance of
posibles
the
específicas,
protocol,
por
such
ejemplo,
as
reducir el número de
incorporating
revisiones,
adaptability
para
to the
permitir
protocol. For example,
esa desviación,
including
esa reducción
acceptable
y en conclusión la
intervals
necesidad de una meta
to,
protocolo, o sea, protocolos con mayor
or
capacidad de adaptabilidad
acceptable intervals
que lleven
for
a
certain
generar menores
specific
enmiendas, menor cantidad de enmiendas al
guidelines in the
protocolo.
protocol, which can
También
reduce
se
the
fomenta la
number
simplicidad y
of
claridad, o sea, un protocolo que tiene que ser claro,
mistakes or
preciso y factible
deviations.
operacionalmente.
We need to foster simplicity and clarity.
Se
The
establecen
protocol needs to
limitaciones
be
de
clear,
tecnología
concise,
necesaria y para
and
evitar
operationally
complicar situaciones
feasible.
importantes.
This
Mejorar
for the
los
purpose of
derechos de
minimizing
seguridad y protección de
unnecessary
las partes
complexity and mitigate or
y, por
eliminate
supuesto,
any
de
important risks
participantes en el ensayo
that could
y
affect the
fiabilidad de
rights,
los datos.
security, or the
También se
well-being of
aborda la implicación
participants
del retiro de
in the
acceso
trial and
público
the
o la
reliability
interrupción
of
por
data.
parte del
It
investigador.
addresses the
Y se define la
implication
sección
of
estadística para elegir
withdrawing
metodologías
consent
de
or any
inferencia.
interruption by
Por
the
ejemplo,
researcher.
diseño y estimandos
It
bayesianos,
also
que
expands
tiene
the
que ver con
statistical
la
section to
estadística
include
bayesiana en
uh,
los diseños
statistical
estadísticos.
inference methodologies such as design and
Digamos,
Bayesian
después de un
estimates.
cierto conjunto de datos
Let's say a
de
certain
participantes,
data set or a
se
certain
hace el
number of
análisis para
participants
poder
undertake the
modificar el tamaño
analysis
de muestra,
to be able to
criterios de
modify the sample
elegibilidad,
size,
etc.
the eligibility criteria, what have you.
En cuanto a registros esenciales, hay
With
una
regard to
orientación
essential
de
records,
esta guía, ¿cierto? La R3, que define un
guidelines
registro que sea
on
esencial.
the definition
Hay una
of an
simplificación.
essential record.
Aquí se señala que se generan
Now,
muchos
we
registros
point out
antes y
here that
durante la
we
realización del ensayo.
generate a lot of
Entonces, la
records,
naturaleza y extensión
both
de estos
prior
registros
as well as during the carrying out of a
emergentes del
clinical
diseño del
trial.
ensayo, su
So
organización, la aplicación de
the
estos recursos a medida del
orientation
riesgo
of
y la
these
importancia y relevancia del registro
records
para el ensayo.
will depend on the
Entonces,
procedure.
digamos, ahí también veo un cambio
So we see a
que ya
change
se
here
aprecia
also
desde la primera, ¿cierto?
compared to
Versión
the
de
earlier
ICH
version
6, que
of
eran tres
ICH
tablas o tres,
E6,
digamos,
and that involves
cantidad, listas de documentos que tienen
3
que estar documentos esenciales antes, durante
available
y después del
documents
del
that
ensayo
are
clínico.
deemed to be
Y esto se
essential.
simplifica a una tabla de
And
ejemplos
we've
de registros
simplified
esenciales
this to a single
que
table
incluyen
of
protocolos,
essential
historial
records
clínico o información
or
básica sobre los
registers
productos,
that
formularios
relate to the
personales informados,
protocol or the
aprobaciones y
product
opiniones
or to informed consent
necesarias.
and other necessary components.
Entonces, ¿qué impacto hay en la inspección
So
y
what is the
fiscalización de los
impact
estudios clínicos acá en
with
el
the
país?
inspection
Primero hay
or
un
the
impacto en la
oversight for
definición de los
clinical
registros.
trials in the
La
countries?
establecición, ¿cierto? ICH
Well,
6
first, the
R3 define los registros esenciales que deben
ICHE6
facilitar la gestión del
defines the
ensayo.
essential
Hay
records that
algunos
need to
cambios, por ejemplo,
facilitate
importantes.
trial management.
Estos registros
There have been
esenciales pueden
some
estar
important
fuera de los
changes in this
repositorios
regard.
de los,
The essential
digamos,
records can be
archivos del
outside
investigador
of the
o archivos
repositories
maestros del centro de
or
investigación.
may not be a part
Y
of
los
the master
patrocinadores
file
investigadores deben
at
hacer el
the
seguimiento de las
research center.
ubicaciones de los registros y de los historiales de versiones.
Sponsors and researchers need
Entonces,
to
todo esto
do
de
a
la
proper
inspección
follow-up for
debe ser
location
mencionado y
of
debe estar,
records and
digamos,
the
adecuadamente
various
documentado.
version histories.
También hay un impacto o se
There's
ve
also an
un impacto en
impact,
la gestión de riesgos.
or we see
Entonces,
an
los
impact in
patrocinadores
the
deben
risk
garantizar
management.
que su sistema de gestión de
So
calidad
sponsors
sea
need to
capaz de
be
gestionar
able
los
to
riesgos
ensure that
clínicos
their
del ensayo
quality management
y se debe
systems
considerar enfoques
are
basados en
sufficiently
los riesgos
capable
para
to
garantizar también
manage
las buenas prácticas
the
manufactura
critical risk
en
elements of
todas
the
las fases de
trial. They need
investigación
to be able
clínica.
to consider different
También hay un
approaches
impacto
based
o
on the risk to
se prevé,
guarantee
¿cierto?, un
best
impacto en el uso de
practices.
tecnologías. Esta guía,
And the
¿cierto?,
last
ICH
impact
R3
that
actualiza
relates
las
to
directrices
the
para el
use of
empleo de tecnologías
technologies.
de vanguardia en la
This
gestión de ensayos clínicos.
standard currently updates
Y
the
tenemos que ir
guidelines
avanzando
for
a la par y se
using
brinda flexibilidad para facilitar el
cutting-edge
uso de innovaciones
technology for
tecnológicas y
clinical
ensayos
trial
clínicos.
management. They offer flexibility
Entonces,
and more
en la
reliability.
inspección justamente de los
Now,
sistemas
when we talk
electrónicos de ensayos
about
clínicos,
the
están estas
inspection
herramientas de software que
of
permiten recopilar,
clinical
validar y almacenar
trials
datos.
electronic systems,
Y tenemos que
we have the aspect related
interiorizarnos,
to monitoring and
capacitar o entrenar
observance, and we have to be
todas las
able
partes
to
interesadas en
provide the
uso de
necessary
distintos
training
sistemas electrónicos. Por
and
ejemplo,
education of
el
all
electrónico,
relevant
este capture, o
personnel
sea, la
in the
captura
use of
electrónica de
these
datos,
electronic
EDC,
systems.
se ve bastante también en las
So we
inspecciones de
do
ensayos
have
clínicos acá en Chile,
some
que permiten
EDC
recopilar datos
systems,
de forma
electronic
celular en
data
tiempo real y que
capture
ofrecen
systems
funciones
that
de
allow
validación inmediata.
for the
Aquí, por ejemplo,
collection
surgió
of data in a safe way in real time and offers different immediate validation functions. We also have the ePro system, electronic patient reported outcome system, that allows for patients being introduced into the system to participate in the clinical trial using a tablet or a computer. We also have the electronic case report form, which allows for the collection of clinical data and the transmission or sending these data through a central digital database. Lastly, we have electronic consent, and this allows patients to understand the objectives of the trial while they provide their consent. So how would we implement ICH E6 in Chile? At the present time, we have exempt resolution number 460, dated January 30th, 2015, which is the guide for approval of good clinical practices developed by the National Medication Agency of the Public Health Institute. It includes good practices guidelines, a glossary, the main guidelines for good clinical practices, the researcher, sponsor, the clinical study protocol, as well as amendments to the protocol, the manual for the researcher, as well as other essential documents to be able to carry out a clinical study. This includes an introduction and the various phases of the study. So the manner in which we intend to implement the standard in Chile is by promoting the same procedure used in ICH E8, and that will be under the purview of the group of regulatory agenda to work on the translation and adaptation for ICH E6. Additionally, we would have to update the clinical studies inspection guide for the ISP. Additionally, we would have to develop an instruction manual on electronic informed consent. We've already begun work on this, even way back when the pandemic started. And the idea would be to upload this to the website, our institutional website, and something that we are foreseeing is being able to provide a decentralized clinical study guide in electronic form that will allow us to conduct timely reporting and assessment of clinical studies with information for all of the participants included. And that's all I have, and Chile has the ISP. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás.
Thank you very much,
Voy a invitar
Nicolás.
a Laura y a Patricia
I'd like
que
to
se
invite
nos
Laura
unan
and
nuevamente
Patricia
para la
to join us
discusión.
once
Y
again
quiero empezar con un
to
tema
have this
que
discussion. I'd like to
amerita
start
una
with a
aclaración
topic that I
inicial y
think
le voy a pedir a
warrants an initial
Patricia
clarification, and I'd like to ask Patricia her
que lo aclare para la
thoughts
audiencia.
and
Antes
her
de abordar
comments
este
to
punto, sin
clarify this for
embargo,
our audience.
quiero
Now, before
resaltar que
we address
contamos
this,
con el
I'd like to
portal de los
highlight
ensayos clínicos
that
de
we
las
have
Américas
the
y muchos
portal
de los
of
temas que
clinical
Patricia va a
trials for the
referir,
Americas, and
que
many
se
of
han
the topics
mencionado
mentioned by
durante la
Patricia
sesión,
and that have been
desde
mentioned throughout the course of the webinar,
ensayos clínicos
that includes
con estadística
clinical
bayesiana
trials with
a
a
los roles de
Bayesian
los comités
statistical
de
analysis to
monitoreo de datos
the
han
roles
sido
of
abordados en
data monitoring
sesiones
committees.
previas.
All of these have been
Entonces,
addressed in
tengan
prior
presente que
sessions of
tenemos
this
todos
webinar
estos
series.
recursos
So I
disponibles
just
para que
wanted to
los
mention that we
consulten
have all of these
de manera
resources available
complementaria.
to anyone
Ahora
interested,
bien,
so you can access them
Patricia, el
uh,
punto
whenever it's
central por el
convenient.
que
Now,
quisiera
Patricia,
empezar este diálogo
the
es
topic
con
that
una
I'd like to
aclaración
begin this
sobre
discussion with
cuáles son
is
las
a
tareas
clarification
de la
regarding
Agencia
the
Regulatoria Nacional
regulatory,
en lo
national
que le compete a la
regulatory
fiscalización
agency
de ensayos clínicos,
tasks,
a
the ones that
diferencia de
provide
las tareas que
oversight
le
for
corresponden
clinical
a
trials,
un comité
and how do
de
they
ética
differ
de la
from the
investigación.
ethics committee involved in
Bueno,
these
muchas gracias,
trials?
Carla, por la pregunta. Vi varias preguntas que
Thank
me
you very
parece
much, Carla,
necesario
for the
aclarar,
question. I think
y
there's a
que
number
tienen
of
que ver con
questions
este tema.
I should clarify.
Como dijimos,
They're all related to the same topic. As we said, ICH R6E3 is a standard for clinical trials that must be recorded by the regulatory agencies. So that would be my first point, because in the case of these clinical studies, it's up to the regulatory agencies to ascertain that these trials provide the information needed to assess the risk-benefit profile of the product, that the data used are credible, and make it possible for the regulatory agency to reach a decision. But there's two different sides to approval. There has to be approval by the ethics committee and then approval by the regulatory agency. In the case of the ethics committee, the committee must assess the study in the population looking at ethical and methodological factors. And the standard for that are the international ethical standards. So it doesn't just apply to clinical trials for drugs to be registered. It also looks at other medications. It also looks at clinical trials involving other health technologies as well as clinical studies themselves. So it's looking at the ethical and methodological dimensions based on those international standards as they apply to those specific agencies. The agency, the regulatory body, does not look at the trials themselves. They consider the trial as part of the development process of a product with the aim of either approving the product or amending the existing record, meaning that this clinical process is part of a broader process that includes all stages from manufacturing to the clinical evidence available to approve the product or to amend what is already in the record, a new usage, a new population, which may be considered for a particular usage. So these are two different bodies. ICH E6R3 and its Annex 2 is not meant to be applied to all the studies. That would be a mistake. The reason for the change, and you can see this if you read the document, the reason the ICH E6R3 was changed is because it was over-applied. It was applied to all clinical studies, but this is a mistake because these are documents prepared by regulatory agencies and by the pharmaceutical industry with the purpose of setting standards for that small subset of clinical trials that are going to become part of the health registry. So this guide is not going to address deeper aspects related to informed consent. It is going to look at the elements of informed consent that complement what is already in the guides for a clinical trial for registration purposes, but it's not going to delve into informed consent because these guidelines complement each other. And I always like to tell a story. When I talked to the ethics committee, I wanted to look at misuse of medications. I wanted to perform a survey looking at the effects of this, but the ethics committee wanted a very large number of elements which were based on ICH.
Si había una serie con respecto al consentimiento y demás.
So in the case of consent,
no porque no tuviera que haber consentimiento, no estoy hablando de
it wasn't that we were saying that there should not have been consent, but there were a number of issues that invalidated what we could get from the study. they introduced a bias. Instead of looking at all the clinical areas, we could only consider 3 patients in the practice because we were unable to apply everything they indicated. So that, for me, is not a good application of the ICH guideline, because ICH, the guideline does not supersede everything else. It is meant to complement other technical guidelines, other clinical guidelines. So there are many elements that need to be considered. So the SIAM's guide need to be considered because they provide some of the answers. They're not provided by the ICH guideline. These only apply to clinical trials that are meant for registration purposes to add or amend existing registries. So I don't know, Carla, if this answers your question.
Absolutamente.
Thank you very much. It does. As an ethicist, another
Another
way to say what you said is that the fact that something must be done doesn't mean that it is necessarily the obligation of X to do it. The National Regulatory Agency has many important and specific functions, but it's not meant to take the place of an ethics committee. Nor is the ethics committee meant to act as a regulatory agency. So it applies both ways. And yet, I would say that a positive result of this review of the good clinical practices, at least for me, is that we are starting to speak the same language. One of you, I'm not sure if it was Laura, Patricia, or Nicolás, used the word ecosystem. That is what this is. There are a series of stakeholders and tasks, and the ecosystem becomes more of a system if we all speak the same way. If the regulatory agency also starts to look at consent as a process, then we can all understand each other better. It doesn't mean that the National Regulatory Agency is going to replace the Ethics Committee role in reviewing informed consent. But I would say that we are becoming increasingly aware of the fact that this is a process. And there's many things we've talked about at other times. For example, how informed consent must be dynamic. I can see that Sarah sent you a publication, how to catalyze ethical research or trials during an emergency. I think that with the pandemic, many of us
ya el consentimiento informado
finally
no es lo que era.
understood that informed consent
Sí, no es lo que era antes. Tenemos
is no
recursos
longer what it
distintos,
used to
así
be.
como estamos teniendo
We have
esta
different
conversación con
resources,
recursos distintos
and we're
que no
using different
teníamos
tools
antes.
now for this
Entonces,
conversation, which we did not have in the past.
creo que
So
quizás uno de los temas más
I would say that
novedosos
one of
importantes
the
que mencionó Patricia ya y sobre el que
newest and
quisiera
important
sí,
issues
tanto
brought by
Patricia como si
Patricia to the
quieren
table,
Laura y Nicolás,
and which
desde
I
el
would
lado de
ask
la
her
adopción de los países,
or Laura
pudieran
and Nicolas to
expandirse,
speak to
es
at greater
sobre
length
el tema
from
de
their
los
country's
datos del
perspective
mundo real.
is
Porque creo que
real
acá hay
world data.
hay un desafío importante y lecciones
I think there's a
importantes
major challenge there. There are
les
important
agradecería si
lessons as
pudieran
well.
comentarnos más
And
sobre
I would
este
appreciate if you
asunto
could
específico.
elaborate on what you said about this specific
Si
issue.
quieren empiezo yo. O sea,
If
los
you'd like,
estudios
I'd
de
be
datos
happy to
del mundo
start.
no son,
The
estoy
real
diciendo
world
mal.
data
O
studies,
sea,
or
es
rather,
la
I'm misusing the
utilización de
term.
datos del mundo real,
I should say using
ya se
real
efectúa.
world data
Entonces,
is something
los
that we are
protocolos de
already
ensayos
doing.
clínicos
So the
tienen una
clinical
validez
trials
interna muy
protocols
fuerte porque
have
tienen criterios de inclusión y
a
exclusión
major valence
muy
because they
cerrados
have
a
very
fin de
closed inclusion
garantizar la
criteria.
homogeneidad de
And the aim
de
of
la
these is
población
to
que
make
se está
sure
estudiando.
that we
Pero
are
esto no es el
studying a
mundo real.
population that is
Estarían las
homogeneous.
personas que
But that is
después van a
not what the
tomar el
real world
producto,
is like. People who are
tienen un
going to be
sinnúmero de situaciones
taking
en
the
donde toman
product
otras
are very
medicaciones,
different.
están
They
en
may be
otras
taking different
situaciones.
medications. They have other
Entonces,
conditions.
es necesario
So it is
qué pasa con esas
necessary
personas, por
for us to
ejemplo,
know
para dar
what
un
happens
ejemplo,
with those
en
individuals.
situaciones del mundo real. Y
And
ahora
we
con
do
los
that by
registros
using
electrónicos,
real world
o por
situations
ejemplo
now
con
with
algunos
electronic
reclamos sobre
records
eventos
or with
de
some
seguridad
claims
particulares
related
u
to
otros tipos de
specific
registros,
security
uno puede
or
obtener
safety
mucha
issues,
información
it
que es
is
muy
possible to
valiosa para la
access a
agencia
great deal of
regulatoria, para la
information,
seguridad y para
which
el
is useful
patrocinador,
for the
para
National
medir su
Regulatory
seguridad
Agency and
o
for the
para
sponsor
complementar algún
when
estudio
assessing safety
particular que se
or
tenga que
when
hacer después
complementing
sobre un
another
aspecto de
specific or
seguridad que
subsequent
aparece
study
o
on an
para un
additional
punto
safety
final de
aspect,
eficacia en particular.
or also looking at
O por ejemplo, en las
efficacy
enfermedades
issues.
raras,
In the
no
case of
tenemos
rare
tanta población,
diseases,
no hay
there the
miles de
population is
pacientes.
smaller. We
Entonces,
don't have
obtener
thousands
cuál
of
es el
patients.
desarrollo natural de la enfermedad, qué está pasando con
So
la
following the
población ya
natural
tratada
course of
de
the
esa
disease,
enfermedad,
what has already
son
happened
datos
with the population being
realmente
treated,
importantísimos.
that
Esos
information
son datos del
is
mundo real
extremely
que se pueden
important.
tomar para
That is the type of
complementar
real
aspectos
world data
regulatorios
we can use
de
to
una aprobación de
supplement
un producto.
regulatory
Esto ya se
aspects
toma en la
pertaining to a
seguridad.
product's approval.
Les
It's
comparto
already being
después, hay
done for
dos
safety.
guías muy
I will
importantes que
share
salieron en
this
este
later,
tema.
but there
Una
are
es de la
two
Organización
major
Mundial de la
guidelines
Salud,
that have
la
been
otra es la
published.
guía de la
One is from the
FDA,
WHO,
donde
the other one is from the
contextualizan
FDA,
entonces
and they
en
provide
qué puede
context.
contribuir estos
They
datos del mundo
indicate
real
how
a
real-world
estas
data
aprobaciones
can
regulatorias,
contribute to
complementando
regulatory
los estudios
approvals.
clínicos
And this
que se
complements the
hacen
work done
ahora
through
para que esos
clinical
datos puedan
trials
ser tomados.
currently.
Son tan heterogéneos
Because the
tiene que haber una
populations
serie
are
de
diverse,
pautas
it is important to have
importantísimas para que el
certain
dato pueda ser
common
preciso,
points so
creíble
that
e
we use
íntegro.
data that
Y
is
entonces
consistent,
esas
credible,
pautas están
and has
desarrolladas en esa
integrity.
guía y la
So
toma la ICH en este anexo 2.
this
Lo otro
is
son
what
los
is
estudios
being
descentralizados y
currently
los
discussed and
pragmáticos,
which
los
will be
científicos
included in
realistas. Eso
Annex 2.
todo
The
está
other is
en
the
el anexo
decentralized
2.
and pragmatic
Por
studies. These
supuesto,
are
hoy
covered in
tanto,
Annex 2 as
tanto
well, as I said.
ICH 6R3,
But these
que nosotros tomamos
ICH
algunos aspectos, cambian
R63
algunos
has so
más.
many elements we could
Tomamos los
only cover a
fundamentales. Hay
few.
todo un
We
anexo
thought we
que
covered
se
what would be
refiere a
most
estos
important. There are many
puntos.
more
En
annexes
el,
that
ahora
deal
vamos a
with
subir
these other
documentos
issues. We will be
no me sale la palabra
uploading documents. I can't remember
plataforma de ensayo.
what the word is. It's for the portal. We'll be uploading documents to the portal.
Estos documentos que digo de la Organización Mundial
And among those
y la,
documents are the WHO document
FDA con
and
respecto, por
also the
ejemplo, a este
FDA
tema,
document on this subject.
documentos con respecto a cómo
We're also
analizar
going to
los
include
estudios
documents on how to
adaptativos, o sea, todos
analyze
documentos que
adaptive
puedan
studies.
servir tanto para las
Other
agencias
information
regulatorias
that would be
cuanto
useful for
también para los
regulatory
comités de ética que
agencies
quieren
as
llevar
well
la
as for
metodología y
ethics
se encuentran
committees.
con una serie
They
de
have the
cosas
methodology, but
nuevas
then they encounter
que
new
no
elements.
crean que a ustedes solos les cuestan, que nos
So
cuestan
it's
a
not
todos
just hard for
y
you,
de
it's
la
hard
cual
for
tenemos
all
que
of
empezar a
us.
leer, ¿no?
And it is important for us to start to learn
Laura,
what to do
Nicolás,
with
algo que
them.
quieran complementar
Laura or
ustedes para este
Nicolás, is
punto.
there
Adelante.
anything you would care to add on this
Sí,
point?
bueno, Patricia ya dio una respuesta muy
Well,
completa.
Patricia has already given us a
Para
very
nosotros,
thorough
esta
answer.
revisabilidad del ICH es una oportunidad
For
para
us,
analizar
the
este
revised
punto,
ICH
cuáles van a
is an
ser
opportunity
qué
to
calidad
analyze
van a
these
tener esos
points.
datos que se van a adquirir en la
What
vida
is going to
real,
be
cuál va a
the
ser la
quality of
calidad,
data obtained
para
in real
también abrir la
life?
discusión
That is a
y
good
hacer un
starting
análisis
point for the
bastante
discussion.
pero sí, me parece que bueno, ya se hace necesario
But
utilizar y
I would
avanzar.
say that we need to be able to use them and to learn how to do that.
Y bueno, también quisiera complementar que en realidad
I
se
would
ha
like to
señalado
add
bastante de
that
los datos del mundo
much
real
has
o
been said
evidencia del mundo
about
real.
real world data
Y
or
justamente
real world
faltan pautas.
evidence,
Como autoridades regulatorias tenemos que
and we
avanzar
do
y no
need
solo en
to
estudios clínicos, sino
have
que en el registro de
more
productos farmacéuticos. Ya se emplean
guidance.
algunos datos
In the pharmaceutical world,
en sesiones, en
we're already
comisiones de
using
evaluación con expertos
data
externos, incluso
committees of external
acá en Chile también
experts, for
cuando hay poca
example.
evidencia, pocos estudios clínicos, hay
When
también
evidence is
evidencia
limited, when there are
de
few
uso
clinical trials,
en
we
otros
look at
países,
evidence of
en
usage in
laboratorios
other
paradisíacos, ¿cierto?
countries or
Claro, son
elsewhere.
datos que pueden tener un mayor grado de desorden o
So the
de
data may
sesgo.
not be as
Entonces,
organized or
tenemos
it may also
que
be more
ojalá emitir
biased.
algún lineamiento
So it would be
como
useful to
institución
have
pública bueno, como
guidelines
autoridad reguladora, ¿cierto?,
as a public
latinoamericana,
institution, as a regulatory
para poder establecer
agency.
qué se
We
puede
would
respetar,
welcome
digamos, qué
indications as to what we can use
digamos, de forma más objetiva, considerar eficacia,
objectively,
seguridad,
looking at efficacy,
para
safety,
aprobar la comercialización de productos
when
farmacéuticos
approving the
y
marketing
también
of
para poder
pharmaceuticals,
aprobar o autorizar estudios clínicos,
and
como
also
también como nivel de
to
evidencia,
approve or
enfermedades
clear clinical
raras,
studies.
hay diferentes aspectos
Also,
que tienen
for
que
rare
considerarse,
diseases, there are a number of
pero sí,
aspects
sin duda
that
hay que
should be
avanzar
considered.
en la implementación de ello.
But I do think it is important to move forward with
Elementos que
implementation.
a veces también son muy útiles
One
para
or
poblaciones
elements that may also be
específicas que no
useful
están
is
contempladas dentro de los
specific
estudios
populations
también.
that were not
Entonces queremos saber qué
included
pasa ahí.
in the trial, so we'd like to know what happens with them.
Patricia, yo decía hace un momento que yo le leo la mente
A
a
few minutes
Patricia,
ago, I
pero
was
ella
saying
también
that
me
I
la
can
lee
read
a mí,
Patricia's
porque
mind,
yo
but
quería
I think she
volver
also
sobre el
can read
tema de
my
poblaciones
mind. I
especiales,
wanted to go back to the issue of special
que sobre
population
hay
groups.
alguna pregunta ahí sobre el tema de poblaciones
We
específicas, y lo
received
quería
some
enlazar
questions
con esta
about specific
pregunta
population groups, and I'd like to tie
porque
that in with this
en su
question.
respuesta, Patricia y los demás
In
panelistas
your
han
answers,
enfatizado de que,
Patricia
por
and
ejemplo, el
panelists,
rol que
you
tiene esta
emphasize the
nueva
role
manera de
of this
recoger datos,
new
de obtener
way
datos
of capturing
para las
data,
enfermedades
of
raras, para
collecting data for
situaciones
rare
en que no tenemos
diseases,
otra opción a
for
veces,
situations
no
where we
hemos
may
planeado
not
otra
have
opción
other options
para producir la evidencia necesaria.
and may not be
Y
able to produce the necessary evidence.
resaltando las coherencias desde las coherencias entre las orientaciones
So
éticas
it's
y las
important to
autorizaciones,
ensure that there is consistency
las
between
orientaciones regulatorias.
ethical
Uno de los
guidance
temas
and
que
regulatory guidance.
resaltaron los expositores antes como un tema importante de
One
esta
thing
nueva
panelists
versión de buenas
highlighted as
prácticas
being
clínicas
important
es
for this new version of good
tema de la
clinical
inclusión de
practices
poblaciones
is including
específicas.
specific populations,
Niños, mujeres embarazadas,
children,
personas
pregnant women,
mayores que históricamente se
elderly
han excluido.
populations,
Y
individuals
yo,
who are groups that may have been
desde la
excluded in the
perspectiva
past.
de la ética, creo que todos vemos un lenguaje
From an
muy
ethics
fuerte
standpoint,
en
I think
SIOMS,
we're all
insistiendo que es una injusticia,
seeing
que
how
tenemos la
SIOMS
obligación moral
is
de
stressing
rectificar
the
y que
unfairness
hayamos
of
categóricamente
this exclusion.
excluido a muchas
It's something that
poblaciones
needs to be
de la
corrected.
investigación en general y los
Many
ensayos
population
clínicos
groups
en
have been
particular.
excluded from the research and
Patricia,
from
no sé si
clinical
quieres
trials
ahondar
in
un poco
particular.
más
Patricia,
sobre
would you like to
sobre
elaborate
las
on
poblaciones
the
especiales y si
special
Laura y Nicolás desde
population
su
groups?
parte
And
pueden
I would
contar
also
sobre
ask Laura and
los
Nicolas to
desafíos
tell us
que
about
desde
the
el ámbito de la
challenges
implementación, este mandato con el que creo que
they
todos
have
estamos
faced when
convencidos
it
de que es
comes
lo
to
correcto, pero
implementing this
los
mandate.
desafíos que
We may
implementar
all be
ese mandato
convinced
implica.
that it is the
Sí,
right one,
primero
but it
responderle
does come with
una
challenges.
cosita que
Well,
apareció en el
first,
chat
let
de nuevo.
me
De nuevo
address
decir
something
que
that
la
came up in the
ICH
chat
no
again.
busca,
ICH
a ver, estar sobre las guías éticas ni
does
reemplazarlas.
not
Entonces
intend to
alguien pregunta ahí
supersede
si habla del
any
placebo.
ethical
No, no habla del
guidance.
placebo, habla del placebo
Somebody asked about
metodológicamente
whether it applies or
la
talks
parte de
about placebo.
estadística
It
y otras
doesn't
guías,
talk to
pero desde el punto
placebos.
de
It
vista
looks
ético,
at
cuándo debe usarse placebo o cuándo no,
methodology.
para eso están las guías
But when
de
it comes to
SIOMS,
whether or
que
not to
es muy,
use
insisto,
placebos, there we
muy
have
y
other guidelines. We
si
have
ustedes ven, el
the
principal
SUMS
principio se
guidelines, and if you
basa
look
en el
at the main
reconocimiento
principle,
el primer
it is
principio
based, it's the first principle
para qué se
actually,
hacen los ensayos
it
y el
is
reconocimiento de las
related to
guías
the
éticas.
purpose
O
of the
sea que
trials,
ya
and it also
no es que
references
revisa eso, ya
ethics
las tiene como
guidance. It is not
referente de lo
something
que
it
debe ser.
revisits. They are
Así que
already
no vuelve
considered
a
as
hablar
part of
de
the
eso.
reference
Ahora,
material.
entonces sí, me llamó la atención, o sea, se está trabajando, simplemente decir esto,
I
en
just
hay
wanted to
guías que ya
mention
salieron, pediatría.
that some
¿Cuándo debe el
guidelines have already
desarrollo,
been
de
published?
acuerdo
For
a si es una
example,
enfermedad que solo se da en
the guideline
pediatría
for
o es una enfermedad
pediatrics.
que es diferente cómo se manifiesta en
What
pediatría
happens
que en la edad adulta o
when
es completamente
there are
igual? ¿En
differences
qué
when a
periodo del
disease
desarrollo del
is different
medicamento debe
in
comenzarse
children than
con
it
los
is
estudios
in adults?
pediátricos? ¿Qué tipo de estudios debe haber?
How
¿Y qué
does that
consideraciones
impact
específicas
medication? What special
lo mismo
considerations
sucede
need to
con
be studied?
pediatría, lo
The
mismo
same
surge con los
happens with
factores
geriatrics
étnicos, que eso es
and with
importantísimo,
ethnic factors, which may be at play. There may be differences when it comes to metabolism in different regions, which may call for changes or the need may flag the need to have data about different populations. There may be cytochromal differences which may warrant consideration. This guideline includes something ICH has already been working at, which is not excluding population groups. And there's a document in the works on pregnancy, because all the women who are here and may have been pregnant know that when we're pregnant, sometimes it's hard to know what to do with treatment or medications because many have not been approved specifically for pregnant women. So ethical considerations are not going to be set here. They are in a different document. What ICH does is say that in principle, there should be no exclusion of population groups. It's unfair to exclude those groups. And it does clarify the types of studies where this does or does not apply. A phase 1 or bioequivalence or bioavailability study is obviously not going to include pregnant participants, but other studies may. And there may be other specificities, other characteristics to be taken into account. That's just to give you an example of what is considered in the case of a special population group. Laura, Nicolás, anything from you on the challenges you faced in implementing this? I would say that it's important to integrate special populations, be it pregnant women, children, or patients with orphan diseases or with other specific features. If we are overly protectionistic and if we exclude them, we may find that this limits our therapeutic options. How do we know how to treat those patients? How do we know what to do with them if we lack evidence? So I do think it is important to promote research in these populations. But we should do so by using a risk-based approach as advocated by the ICH. And we need to have criteria that are applicable to those populations. It depends on the group we are considering, but it is important to have measures to mitigate risk. We also think that if the sample size is small, we need to consider how the data is going to be analyzed. If it's a small population, if it's children, there are fewer children than adults, so it's important to know how to extrapolate from the information we are able to obtain, what scientific method is going to be used. And then there's what Patricia said, the ethical considerations, informed consent, how these need to be adapted for those special populations. They must obviously take their characteristics into account, whether they're able to provide consent or agree with a procedure. Those are just some of the challenges I think need to be analyzed. And Carla, just to make sure that we don't combine what is regulatory with what is ethical, not up to ICH to analyze the cases to be included. We have ethical guides for that, for diseases that are specific to a given population group. That is not the purview of the regulatory agency. That is why we have international ethical regulations, which the Ethics Committee know quite well. Here, we're trying to establish specific parameters for products in those specific population groups without overlooking what is already in the guideline. Nicolás, we have very little time left. Could we have some final comments from you about implementation, and
Sí,
after
claro.
that, we will
Bueno,
adjourn.
en resumen, es importante que como autoridad reguladora, pero
I
también
think that
aquí
as a
comité
regulatory
de ética, que sobre otros
agency and
puntos importantes
also
que están
as
antes, ¿cierto?
an ethics committee, which
que
is
nuestra
also an
exposición,
important body which comes first in the
digamos, se
sequence,
favorezca la evaluación
that
primero,
we
que si hay un mérito ético y científico, se
promote
aprueben
evaluation, and
protocolos
that
que
when
involucren no
there's a
solo la inclusión
scientific merit, that
de
we
poblaciones,
have
digamos,
protocols
especiales,
that will
por ejemplo,
consider
en
special
Latinoamérica,
population
población
groups.
indígena,
In Latin America, this could be
inmigrantes,
indigenous populations,
niños
immigrants,
también, estudios en
children,
embarazadas también,
also
específicos,
studies in pregnant
pero
women.
obviamente que sea hacerlo justo
We need to make sure
también
that
análisis de subgrupos. No
we
solo
do
incluir
this fairly
participantes,
and
sino
that
que
we
también
analyze
analizar
subgroups, not just include
justamente,
them
como
as
decía Patricia,
participants, but also, as Patricia said,
aspectos metabólicos,
look at
farmacocinética, etcétera.
differences there may be,
Porque sin
metabolic
duda, claro, hay
aspects,
que
for
promover
example.
digamos, la
I
inclusión
do
de estas
believe that
poblaciones
we
específicas.
should
Eso, gracias.
work on including
Muchas
these special
gracias, Nicolás.
populations.
Un
Thank
poco
you,
en esa línea del
Nicolás.
análisis que hay que hacer también con los datos que
Also,
tenemos y que a veces
speaking
no
of
valoramos.
how we use the data
Sara
we
les ha
have
compartido
for
la orientación de
analytical purposes,
que es una
Sarah has
orientación
shared
que
the PREVENT
desarrollamos con la Universidad de
guidelines with
Hopkins,
you. We
que
developed
es
it with the Johns
específicamente una
Hopkins
orientación
University,
ética sobre embarazadas
and it
y
is
vacunas
ethical
contra las
considerations
amenazas
for pregnant
epidémicas
women
emergentes, pero
and
que
vaccines to
es muy
protect them from
práctica, no
emerging
solamente con miras a los nuevos estudios que hay que hacer, sino al
emergencies.
uso
It
de los
doesn't just
datos que
relate
tenemos
to the use of these, but
y
rather how to
además algo
use the
que
data
creo
we
que ha sido un
have,
tema recurrente
and something
de la
which I think
presentación de
has been a
Patricia
recurrent topic
y que
in
es un
Patricia's
mensaje que
presentation.
yo creo
And it
es uno de los
is,
más importantes en
I
esta
think,
nueva
one of the
versión
most important takeaways in
de
this
las buenas
new
prácticas clínicas, que es
ICH
un poco esto
Good
de
Clinical
anticiparnos.
Practice Guide. It is getting ahead
A los
of
escenarios
the
desde el momento de la
scenarios,
planeación del estudio,
starting when
a los
studies are
escenarios
being
particulares del uso de
planned,
datos, escenarios
considering
más
potential
complejos,
scenarios related to data use,
anticiparnos en vez de
more
terminar y
complex
luego ponernos a
scenarios, rather
pensar
than
cómo
waiting
hacer el
until the end
manejo
to
de
start
esos
to
datos.
figure out how we should
Quiero darles
handle
las
the data.
gracias
I want to say
por
thank you
acompañarnos
for
a
joining
nuestros
us.
panelistas el día
I
de
thank
hoy.
our panelists for being here
Gracias
today.
Laura, gracias
I thank
Nicolás, gracias
Laura, I thank
Patricia
Nicolás and
y
Patricia.
gracias a todos los
And
participantes.
thank you
Y
to
queremos
all
reiterar que
participants
están
who have
todos
joined
invitados
us
a
today.
suscribirse a nuestra
You're all
lista de
invited to
investigación
sign up
ética y
for our
además
ethical
a visitar
research
nuestro portal de
roster,
ensayos
for our list, and also visit our clinical
de la
trial
OPS,
portal.
que es por donde pueden
It's the
acceder
PAHO portal,
además
which
a
provides
las
you with
sesiones
access
previas, a
to
recursos de los que hemos
past
mencionado.
webinars, also some
Y
of the
bueno, están
resources we have
todos
mentioned.
serán invitados por medio de nuestra lista a la
So
nueva,
if you join the
a la
list,
próxima
you will be
sesión
receiving
de
an
esta serie de
invitation to
webinars
the
enfocados
next
en ensayos clínicos que
webinar
creo que
in
se va a
this
realizar
clinical
sobre
trial
el
series,
documento
which I believe
de
will
la
be
OMS
on
que
the
Patricia
WHO
compartió
document,
inicialmente.
which Patricia
Tenemos
shared
mucho
with us.
trabajo por hacer y les agradezco
We
su
have a lot of work to
participación, su
do. I
entusiasmo.
thank you for
Gracias
being
también
here, for
a
your
nuestros
enthusiasm,
intérpretes
and I also
y a los
thank our
colegas que
interpreters
nos
and
dan apoyo
the
atrás de las
colleagues
bambalinas
who
para
support us
permitir que esta sesión
backstage in
llegue a
order to
toda la
make
región,
this meeting
tanto ahora
possible,
como luego. Muchísimas gracias.
and for others to see it here and in the region,
Gracias por la
presently and
invitación.
also in the future.